There is a lake in Ontario that should not exist the way it does. Not geologically, not according to any natural process that modern science can cleanly explain. It sits in a basin so perfectly circular, so symmetrically carved into the ancient Canadian Shield, that when the first aerial surveys were completed in the early 20th century, the geologists who studied the photographs put them aside and ordered new ones, certain the cameras had somehow distorted the image. The new photographs came back showing the same thing, a circle, nearly perfect, kilometers across, filled with dark water that, in certain seasons, takes on a quality of stillness so absolute that it seems less like a lake and more like a mirror placed there by something that wanted the sky to see its own reflection. The lake is called Charity Lake, and it sits in the Sudbury Basin, and most people who drive past it on the highway think nothing of it at all. But the researchers, who have spent years studying what lies beneath the surface of Ontario, beneath its forests, and its shield rock, and its deep cold waters, they know that Charity Lake is only the beginning. It is a footnote, an appetizer, a single strange sentence at the start of a document that runs for pages and pages, and none of those pages have ever been read by the people who live above them. Ontario is the kind of place that teaches you to think you know it. It gives you its face willingly. The long silver lines of the Great Lakes, the boreal forest pressing north until it dissolves into the Arctic, the thin soil of the Canadian Shield, scraped clean by glaciers so old that the ice itself is now legend, billions of years of exposed rock, the oldest surface on the planet, worn smooth and patient, and utterly indifferent to the brief drama of human civilization playing out on top of it. You can drive for hours through Ontario and feel like you are moving through a landscape that has no secrets, because the secrets are not on the surface, they are underneath it. They are in the rock, in the water, in the soil that accumulates, in the valleys and the lake beds where nobody has thought to look. They are in the stories that the Anishinaabe people have been telling for generations, stories that the settlers who arrived from Europe heard and categorized as myth, as legend, as the kind of colorful tradition that a colonizing culture files away under folklore and promptly ignores. But myths do not usually contain accurate descriptions of specific geological formations. Legends do not typically include navigational information that can be independently verified. The stories the Anishinaabe tell about certain places in Ontario describe things that real and careful investigation has since confirmed were actually there, under the water, under the soil, waiting. This is what we are going to explore tonight. Not just the megalithic structures, though those are real and those are extraordinary, and we will spend a great deal of time with them. We are also going to explore the framework around them, the culture, the technology, the social organization, and the pure, staggering ambition that would have been required to create what appears to have existed in Ontario before the last glacial maximum scraped the surface clean and then filled the valleys with meltwater. We are going to talk about the sites that archaeologists have identified and then quietly declined to study further. We are going to talk about the ones they have studied and then published in journals that most people never read. We are going to talk about the things that Indigenous oral tradition has been insisting are there, and that conventional archaeology spent decades dismissing before the sonar equipment and the satellite imaging started confirming them one by one. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. The deep past has a quality to it, a texture that is unlike anything else you will find when you close your eyes and let someone guide your imagination. There is something about vast stretches of time, about civilizations whose names we do not know, about structures built by hands that decomposed to dust 30,000 years ago, that loosens the grip of the present. The anxiety of the day dissolves when you consider how long the Canadian Shield has been lying there, patient and enormous, holding whatever was built on it before the ice came. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Now, let us go beneath Ontario. The first thing you need to understand about the Canadian Shield is that it is not simply old. Old does not begin to cover it. The shield is composed of rock that formed between 1 billion and 4 billion years ago, which means that some of what lies beneath your feet in northern Ontario was crystallizing from molten material before multicellular life existed anywhere on Earth. Before animals, before plants, before anything we would recognize as biology had sorted itself out into the forms we know today. The shield is the exposed core of an ancient mountain range, worn down to its roots by forces that operated over timescales so vast that the human mind essentially cannot hold them. We say the numbers, we write them down, we nod and move on, because that is all we can do. The numbers do not fit inside the experience of being alive. But here is the thing that matters for our story. Because the shield is so old, because it has been worn so smooth, because the glaciers of the last ice age scraped it so thoroughly, it tends to be treated as a kind of geological blank slate. The ice came, the ice left, and whatever was there before the ice came was erased. That is the assumption. That is the framework within which Canadian archaeology has largely operated since the discipline was formalized in the 19th century. The ice was a reset button. The ice pressed delete. Whatever the first peoples who arrived in the Americas after the glacial retreat found when they arrived was essentially a new landscape, raw and empty, waiting to be settled. The problem with this framework is that it does not hold up to scrutiny, not when you look closely, not when you start paying attention to the anomalies that accumulate when you spend enough time examining the aerial surveys, the sonar data, the satellite imaging, the ground-penetrating radar results that have been quietly generated by various university research teams and provincial geological surveys over the past 4 decades. The anomalies are there. They have always been there. They simply have not been assembled into a coherent picture, partly because no single researcher has had access to all of the data at once, and partly because the picture that starts to emerge when you do assemble them is one that the existing frameworks of archaeology and geology were not built to accommodate. What the data shows, taken together, is evidence of deliberate construction, evidence of stone arrangements that follow geometric patterns too precise to be natural, evidence of structures that appear to align with astronomical events in ways that would require sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics to achieve, evidence of what appear to be subterranean passages, not natural cave systems, but constructed tunnels existing beneath the surface of the shield at depths that place them well below the level that would have been affected by glacial action, and evidence, perhaps most remarkably, that some of these structures are of a scale that dwarfs anything we currently attribute to pre-Columbian North America. We need to begin with the Sudbury Basin, because the Sudbury Basin is where the anomalies first start to cluster in a way that becomes impossible to dismiss individually. Most people know the Sudbury Basin as the site of one of the largest meteor impact craters on Earth. The Sudbury Igneous Complex, as geologists call it, was formed approximately 1.85 billion years ago, when an asteroid estimated to have been between 10 and 15 kilometers in diameter struck what is now northern Ontario. The impact was catastrophic on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The energy released was orders of magnitude greater than the event that ended the Cretaceous period. The crater that formed was originally estimated to have been approximately 250 kilometers in diameter before subsequent geological processes compressed and deformed it into the elliptical shape we see today, roughly 60 kilometers by 30 kilometers. The basin is important for our story for several reasons. The first is that the impact created a unique geological environment, concentrating certain minerals in ways that do not occur elsewhere, and altering the rock in ways that affected its acoustic properties, its magnetic properties, and its structural characteristics. The second is that the unusual geology of the basin appears to have attracted human attention long before European contact. Archaeological surveys conducted in and around the basin, beginning in the 1970s, recovered artifacts that were described in the initial reports as anomalous. That word appears with a frequency that starts to feel significant when you go back through the literature. Anomalous, meaning they did not fit, meaning the researchers who found them looked at what they had and could not place it cleanly within the existing framework. Some of these artifacts were stone tools of unusual sophistication, not unusual in the sense that they demonstrated a higher level of knapping technique than expected for the time period they were tentatively assigned to, though some did demonstrate exactly that. Unusual in the sense that they were made from materials that had no local source, to flint of a quality and colour that analysis traced to quarries hundreds of kilometres away. Quartzite worked to tolerances that several independent researchers described as requiring more precision than simple handheld percussion flaking would produce. And most puzzling, a series of what appeared to be deliberately shaped granite blocks found in 2 locations at the southern rim of the basin, partially buried, their surfaces exhibiting what 1/1000 1984 report described as machining marks inconsistent with natural erosion. The 1984 report was authored by a geologist named Harlan Vickers, who was at the time conducting a survey for what was then the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. Vickers was not looking for archaeological evidence. He was mapping mineral deposits. The granite blocks were found during a routine survey of a hillside above a small, unnamed lake, and Vickers included them in his report because he had been trained to record all anomalous features. The report was filed. The blocks were described. And then, as far as anyone can determine from the available records, nothing further was done about them. The file exists. The description is there. The coordinates are there. But no follow-up survey was ever commissioned. And when researchers attempting to locate the blocks in the early 2000s went to the coordinates listed in Vickers' report, they found the area had been logged sometime in the intervening years, and the hillside had been significantly disturbed. This pattern, the finding, the filing, the forgetting, is not unique to the Vickers report. It runs through the documentary record of Ontario archaeology like a thread. Something is found. It is noted. It does not fit. And then the institutional machinery that would be required to investigate it further somehow fails to engage. And the finding sits in an archive, and the years pass, and the landscape changes, and the evidence becomes harder to access or is gone entirely. But there are researchers who have chosen not to take the easier path. And what they have spent years doing in Ontario is the work of assembling those filed-away anomalies, those archived reports, those fieldwork notes from surveys conducted for purposes entirely unrelated to archaeology, into something approaching a coherent picture. And the picture that emerges is one that should, by any reasonable standard, be generating significant scientific attention. Let us talk about what is actually there. The Georgian Bay region, that vast inland sea that forms the eastern portion of Lake Huron, has been the focus of some of the most significant recent work on the question of pre-Columbian construction in Ontario. Georgian Bay is enormous, covering approximately 15,000 square kilometres, and its floor has never been systematically mapped with modern sonar technology. What survey work has been done, however, has produced results that several researchers have publicly described as extraordinary. In 2007, a team from the University of Toronto conducting a bathymetric survey of a section of Georgian Bay in connection with a climate change study detected a series of linear features on the lake floor at depths between 8 and 22 meters. The features were described in the survey report as possibly anthropogenic, meaning possibly created by human activity, and were noted as a potential area of interest for archaeological investigation. The features were lines, approximately 2 to 3 meters wide, running in parallel sets across sections of the lake floor, with intersecting lines creating what appeared to be a grid-like pattern over an area of approximately 4 square kilometers. The spacing between parallel lines was not consistent with any natural process the survey team could identify. The depth at which the features were found placed them above what would have been the lake floor at the height of glacial retreat approximately 12,000 years ago, but below what would have been the water level during several intermediate periods in the subsequent millennia. The survey report recommended follow-up investigation. The follow-up investigation was not funded. The data was published in the methodological appendix of a paper primarily concerned with sediment deposition rates in Georgian Bay, and was not highlighted in the abstract or discussion sections of that paper. A researcher named David Chevalier, a retired geological engineer who had spent his career working in the mining sector in northern Ontario, and who had developed an interest in the anomalous features of the shield in his retirement, found the reference in 2011 and spent the next 3 years attempting to obtain funding for a proper investigation of the Georgian Bay features. He did not succeed in obtaining institutional funding. He did, however, manage to organize 2 independent diving expeditions to the site, and the photographs and video footage that those expeditions produced are among the most compelling pieces of evidence for deliberate pre-contact construction in Ontario. The footage shows the features at close range. They are not ambiguous. They are not the kind of thing that could be mistaken for natural rock formations once you are looking at them directly. The lines are cut. Whatever force created them removed material from the lake floor in straight, controlled runs, with edges that are clearly defined and with a consistency of depth and width that natural erosion does not produce. Chevalier's analysis, published in a self-funded report in 2014, argued that the features were consistent with a network of channels, possibly drainage or irrigation infrastructure, of a kind that would have required organized labor and planning to construct. He estimated, based on the length of the features visible in the survey data and extrapolating from the sections the diving expeditions were able to photograph, that the total extent of the network might exceed 40 kilometers. 40 kilometers of constructed channels on what is now the floor of Georgian Bay. The water was not always there. This is the crucial point, and it is the point that makes the Georgian Bay features, and everything else we are going to discuss tonight, plausible in a way that they would not otherwise be. The Great Lakes as we know them today, in their current configuration and at their current levels, are a relatively recent phenomenon in geological terms. The retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier that covered most of Canada during the last glacial maximum, was not a single event. It was a process that occurred over thousands of years, and the shape and extent and depth of the Great Lakes changed dramatically over that period. There were times when Georgian Bay did not exist as a body of water at all, when the land that is now its floor was dry ground, elevated above the surrounding terrain, potentially arable, potentially habitable. The last of these periods of lower water levels ended approximately 7,000 years ago. Before that, for a window of several thousand years following the initial glacial retreat, the area now covered by Georgian Bay would have been, in whole or in part, dry land. People were in North America by then. The evidence for human presence in the Americas, at 14,000 years ago, is now reasonably well established, and there is growing evidence, still contested but accumulating, for human presence significantly earlier than that. The people who were in Ontario during the period when Georgian Bay was dry land would have had access to a substantial expanse of territory that is now underwater. They would have built on it, they would have managed it, they would have created infrastructure on it, and when the water came, whether gradually or in one of the several catastrophic flooding events that marked the Great Lakes' complex hydrological history, that infrastructure would have been submerged. What Chevalier and the handful of other researchers who have taken the Georgian Bay features seriously are proposing is not, therefore, a claim that requires an entirely unknown civilization or impossible technology. It is a claim that requires only that we accept that people were present in Ontario during the period when the land was accessible, that they constructed things on that land as people do, and that the water came and covered what they had built. The remarkable thing is not the theory. The remarkable thing is how little attention has been paid to testing it. The Anishinaabe people have been living in the Great Lakes region for a very long time. How long is itself a matter of some scholarly debate, with conventional estimates generally placing their arrival in the region at around 3,000 years ago, and more recent genetic and linguistic analyses suggesting a presence that may extend back significantly further. But what is not debated, among people who have spent time with Anishinaabe oral tradition, is the depth and specificity of the knowledge encoded in those traditions about the landscape of the region, including knowledge about places and features that the people telling the stories could not have observed directly. The Anishinaabe concept of the Manitou, the spirit or animating force that inhabits natural features of the landscape, is often treated in academic discussions as a purely theological or spiritual construct. And it is those things, but it is also, and this is the point that tends to be missed, a mnemonic system, a way of encoding information about specific locations and the specific qualities of those locations in a format that is easy to remember, easy to transmit across generations, and durable in a way that written records are not. When an Anishinaabe elder describes a particular lake as inhabited by a particularly powerful Manitou who must be approached with specific protocols and who has specific relationships with specific seasons and specific weather patterns, specific behaviors in the animals of the surrounding area, they are not speaking metaphorically, they are describing a place. They are providing navigational and practical information about that place in the framework that their tradition has developed for preserving such information. The Anishinaabe oral traditions include references to several specific locations in Ontario where the relationship between the Manitou and the landscape is described in terms that, when translated carefully and mapped against known geography, appear to correspond to sites where anomalous geological or archaeological features have been identified. One of the most consistently referenced of these locations is a place called Manitou Island, in Lake Nipissing. Manitou Island is not unusual in appearance. It is a forested island of modest size, sitting in a lake that itself has no particular distinguishing characteristics visible from the surface. But Anishinaabe tradition describes Manitou Island as a place of enormous spiritual significance, a location where the boundary between the physical world and whatever lies beneath it is thin, a place where things that should not be visible sometimes become visible, where the lake does not behave as it should, where the depths contain something that the traditions describe in terms that have been variously translated as the old bones, the stone remembering, and the work of the before people. This last phrase, the before people, recurs in Anishinaabe oral traditions in connection with several specific locations across Ontario. It is distinct from the way the traditions discuss the original human inhabitants of the region, the ancestors of the Anishinaabe themselves. The before people are something else, something older, something that was present in the landscape before the Anishinaabe arrived, and whose presence persists in the form of what was left behind. The traditions do not describe these before people in terms that would allow confident identification with any known archaeological culture. They are not the Haudenosaunee, whose historical relationship with the Anishinaabe is well documented. They are not the Dorset culture people of the north. They are something that the oral traditions place at a greater temporal remove, associated with a time when the landscape was different, when the water was not where it is now, when the forests had not yet come back. The first location we should discuss is the area around Lake Nipissing itself, not Manitou Island specifically, but the broader basin of the lake and the terrain to its south and west. Lake Nipissing was, at various points in the post-glacial history of the Great Lakes system, connected to different bodies of water and at different elevations than it is today. There was a period, roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, when the lake sat at a significantly higher elevation and drained through what is now a dry valley to the south, following a channel that geologists have mapped, but that is now recognized as the bed of an ancient outlet river. Along this ancient drainage channel, a series of surveys conducted between 1995 and 2003 by a team from Laurentian University identified a sequence of stone features that the survey reports describe as possibly artificial and definitely anomalous. The features include a series of what appear to be deliberately placed boulders, each weighing several tons, arranged in a line that follows the ancient drainage channel for approximately 3 kilometers. The boulders are not random. They are not the kind of glacial, erratic deposit that typically produces scatters of large stones across the shield landscape. They are set at regular intervals, approximately 15 meters apart, and they are all of similar size, similar shape, and similar composition, a composition that does not match the bedrock of the immediate area, but does match outcrops, located approximately 20 kilometers to the northeast. Someone moved them. The question is when, and why, and who. The Laurentian team's surveys also identified, at 2 points along the ancient channel, what appear to be the foundations of structures. These are not mounds of earth. The Canadian Shield does not lend itself to mound construction in the same way that the glacial soils of the Ohio Valley do. These are arrangements of smaller stones, laid in patterns that suggest deliberate placement, forming shapes that could be the foundations of structures built from organic materials, wood or hide, that have long since disappeared. The patterns are not identical to each other, which initially seemed to argue against a systematic interpretation, until one researcher pointed out that the variation in the foundation patterns might correspond to different functional types of structure, the way that a house foundation, and a granary foundation, and a workshop foundation would have different layouts even within the same culture. What we can say is that the features are there, that they are unusual, that natural processes do not account for them, and that the oral traditions of the people who have lived in this landscape for generations place significance on this area, specifically in terms that correlate with the presence of the before people and the things they left behind. There is another dimension to the Lake Nipissing evidence that deserves attention, and it comes not from archaeology or from oral tradition, but from bathymetric surveys of the lake floor itself. Lake Nipissing is relatively shallow, with average depths of around 7 meters and a maximum depth of approximately 60 meters in its deeper basins. The shallow sections of the lake, particularly along its northern and eastern margins, have been surveyed with side-scan sonar as part of several ecological and fisheries studies. These surveys were not designed to look for archaeological features. They were looking at sediment type and bottom structure for purposes related to understanding fish habitat. But what the sonar data shows, in addition to information about sediment type and bottom structure, is a pattern of linear features in several areas of the shallow lake floor that is consistent with what Chevalier found in Georgian Bay. Lines. Too straight. Too consistent. Too regularly spaced to be natural. The most extensive of these patterns covers an area of approximately 2 square kilometers in the northwestern corner of the lake. The sonar data shows a network of what appear to be constructed lines, varying in width from approximately 1 meter to approximately 4 meters, intersecting at angles that cluster around 90 and 45 degrees. The pattern has not been dived. No one has put divers or remotely operated vehicles into the northwestern corner of Lake Nipissing to examine these features at close range. The sonar data was published in a fisheries report in 2009. The reference to the anomalous linear features occupies 3 sentences in an appendix. No follow-up was conducted. Now we need to talk about the thing that makes Ontario specifically significant as opposed to just interesting, because what I have described so far could apply to many locations around the Great Lakes. Submerged features, anomalous stone arrangements, oral traditions that encode information about a landscape that has changed. These things are present in various forms all around the Great Lakes Basin, from Michigan to Minnesota to New York. What makes Ontario different, what elevates it from interesting to extraordinary, is the scale of what the combined evidence suggests. The structures or features, or whatever we decide to call them, that have been identified in Ontario are not scattered randomly across the landscape. They cluster, they concentrate. And the clusters, when mapped, produce a pattern that looks less like the random distribution of independent sites and more like the remnants of an integrated system. A system that, at its peak, would have covered an area comparable to many of the great urban regions of the ancient world, not Mesopotamia, not the Nile Valley, but comparable in scale to some of the less discussed, but no less significant civilizational concentrations that archaeology has only recently begun to take seriously, like the mound builder cultures of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, or the earthwork builders of the Amazon basin, whose vast geometric complexes were discovered only after satellite imaging revealed them beneath the jungle canopy. The clustering of the Ontario anomalies follows what appear to be waterways. This makes intuitive sense. People build near water. They build near routes of travel and transport. And the waterways of Ontario, the rivers and lakes and portage routes that the Anishinaabe, and before them whoever came before, would have used to move across the landscape, form a natural network that connects the locations where the anomalies concentrate. But the clustering is tighter than you would expect if it were simply following the general vicinity of water. The features are positioned in ways that suggest strategic placement, high ground overlooking water, positions that would control access between one waterway and another, locations at the intersection of multiple routes. The spatial logic, if you apply the framework of infrastructure analysis, is the spatial logic of a network, of something designed with purpose across a large area by people who understood the landscape at a systemic level. The portage routes are especially significant. A portage is the point where water travel requires overland movement, where a traveller must carry their canoe and gear from one body of water to another, because the two are not connected by navigable water. The portage routes of Ontario were not created by the Anishinaabe. They existed before the Anishinaabe arrived, because they were dictated by the physical geography of the Shield. The same routes that the Anishinaabe used, the same routes that French voyageurs used in the 17th and 18th centuries, the same routes that modern canoeists use today, are the routes through which movement through the Ontario wilderness is physically possible. They are determined by the landscape, and at virtually every significant portage in Ontario, there is something strange in the archaeological record. Something that does not fit. Something that suggests the portage was not simply known but was managed, developed, perhaps even controlled by whoever was using it before the current historical record begins. In some cases, the strange thing is a stone arrangement near the portage that does not resemble anything from the known archaeological record of the region. In other cases, it is evidence of a scale of forest management, in the form of anomalous soil chemistry or pollen records from lake sediment cores, That suggests deliberate human modification of the vegetation over areas much larger than would be expected from a small nomadic band. In still other cases, it is petroglyphs, carved images in rock, that do not fit neatly within the known traditions of any identified pre-contact culture in the region. The Peterborough petroglyphs, one of the most significant and most studied sets of rock carvings in Ontario, are a perfect example of this last category. The Peterborough petroglyphs are carved into a large outcrop of white crystalline limestone on the southern edge of the Canadian Shield, roughly 50 kilometres northeast of the city of Peterborough. There are over 900 individual carvings, making this the largest known collection of Indigenous rock carvings in Canada. The carvings include human figures, animal figures, boats, shamanic images, and a substantial number of abstract geometric forms. They are, without question, significant. They are, without question, the product of careful and deliberate artistic and potentially ceremonial activity carried out over an extended period of time. The conventional interpretation places their creation between approximately 600 and 1100 years before the present, attributing them to Algonquian-speaking peoples. But there are features of the Peterborough petroglyphs that the conventional interpretation struggles to accommodate. The most significant of these is the presence of what appear to be representations of large ocean-going vessels, not canoes, not the small watercraft appropriate to inland lake travel, boats with keels, boats with multiple people aboard, boats of a design that researchers working in the tradition of conventional archaeology have struggled to explain as something other than what they appear to be. Barry Fell, the Harvard marine biologist who spent much of his career pursuing alternative interpretations of pre-Columbian contact, argued in his 1976 book America BC that several of the Peterborough carvings were directly comparable to Bronze Age Scandinavian boat representations, and that others were accompanied by inscriptions in an ancient Iberian script called Ogham. Bell's work was not well received by mainstream archaeologists, and his specific linguistic interpretations were contested by specialists in the relevant scripts. But the images he pointed to are real. The boats are there. The question of what they represent has not been resolved by the conventional interpretation's dismissal of Fell's reading any more than it was resolved by Fell's reading itself. Even more intriguing, from the perspective of our investigation, are the geometric carvings. There are several sets of what appear to be systematic geometric patterns at the Peterborough site, arrangements of lines and angles and regular curves that do not fit easily into the category of symbolic or representational art and look more like diagrams or plans or maps. One set of carvings has been analysed by multiple researchers who reached the same tentative conclusion independently. The pattern is consistent with an aerial representation of a physical landscape feature, not necessarily the landscape of the immediate area, but a landscape with waterways and elevated terrain and something that might be infrastructure. Whether these carvings are maps, whether they were intended as maps, whether the landscape they might represent can be identified with any specific area of Ontario, these questions remain open. They remain open partly because the work required to seriously explore them has not been funded, and partly because the questions themselves are treated as unserious by the institutions that control access to the relevant datasets. What is not in question is that the Peterborough petroglyphs sit at the edge of a geological zone that is itself anomalous, and that the anomalies in that zone cluster around the site in a way that starts to feel like something other than coincidence. Below and around the petroglyph site, in the broader geological context of the limestone formation on which it sits, there are what appear to be natural cave systems. Several have been mapped. Several more have been reported by cavers and not followed up on. The mapped caves are not unusual in themselves. Karst limestone terrain in Ontario produces cave systems as a matter of geological routine. But the mapped caves, in the vicinity of the Peterborough site, share a feature that is not universal in karst systems. Several of them show evidence of modification, walls that have been worked, floor surfaces that appear to have been leveled, passages that seem to have been widened beyond what water erosion would produce. The evidence is subtle and it is contested, and it has not been comprehensively documented, but it is there. The most extensively documented of the caves near the Peterborough site is one that does not appear in any official catalogue of Ontario cave systems. It was reported in the early 1980s by a local farmer who had discovered what he described as a large underground chamber on his property, accessed through a sinkhole that opened following an unusually wet spring. The farmer, whose family asked that his name not be used in any publications about the site, contacted the local university, which sent a team to investigate. The team documented the chamber and reported that it was approximately 12 meters by 15 meters, with a ceiling height of roughly 4 meters, and that the floor was covered with a layer of sediment that had never been disturbed. Beneath the surface of that sediment, a test excavation revealed what the team described as worked stone, several pieces of limestone that had been shaped by human hands, along with fragments of what appeared to be fire-cracked rock from a hearth feature. Charcoal from the hearth was sampled for dating. The results of that dating have never been published. The team from the university submitted their report to the Ontario Ministry of Culture and the funding authority that had supported the investigation, and then the investigation ended. The farmer subsequently closed the sinkhole with fill, having been advised that leaving it open created a liability issue. The chamber is inaccessible. The charcoal samples and the worked stone fragments are in a storage facility associated with the university. The dating results, if they exist, are in a file that researchers who have attempted to access it through Freedom of Information requests have found to be subject to an exemption for materials related to ongoing investigation. An ongoing investigation that, as far as anyone can determine, has not produced any public output in the decades since the original fieldwork. Why? The most charitable interpretation is that the dating results were ambiguous, that the charcoal did not produce a clean date, that the work stone was not definitively artificial, and that the team concluded the site did not meet the threshold of significance required to justify further investment. This happens. Archaeology is full of sites that seemed significant in the field and failed to deliver on that promise when the laboratory results came back. It happens more often than the public realizes, and the gap between the excitement of discovery and the deflation of inconclusive analysis is one of the defining experiences of the discipline. But there is another interpretation, a less charitable one, and it is an interpretation that the pattern of behavior across multiple Ontario sites starts to make feel less paranoid and more like a rational inference from the available evidence. The less charitable interpretation is that the dating results were not ambiguous, that they were clear, that they said something specific about the age of the charcoal in that underground chamber, and that what they said was sufficiently incompatible with the existing framework that the people who received the results chose, consciously or unconsciously, to let them sit in a file rather than publish them and deal with the consequences. Let us step back for a moment and think about what would be required, physically and organizationally, to create the kind of infrastructure that the combined evidence from Georgian Bay, Lake Nipissing, the Sudbury Basin, and the Peterborough area suggests existed in Ontario. Not to prove that it existed, not to resolve the debate, just to think clearly about what we would be positing if we accepted the evidence at face value and asked what its existence implied about the people who created it. The channel network on the floor of Georgian Bay, if Chevalier's analysis is correct and it extends to 40 kilometers in total length, would represent a significant engineering undertaking, not an impossible one. The creation of irrigation and drainage infrastructure of comparable scale has been documented in agricultural societies across the ancient world, from the rice paddies of Southeast Asia to the canal systems of the Mesopotamian plain to the raised field agriculture of the Amazon basin. What it requires is organized labor, sustained over a period of time, directed by people who understood both the hydraulic principles involved and the geographic context in which they were working. This is not exotic technology. It does not require metal tools, though metal tools would certainly have made certain aspects of the work easier. It requires human beings working together with enough organizational capacity to coordinate a large-scale project over a significant period of time. The question of population size is relevant here. One of the reasons that the idea of significant pre-Columbian construction in Ontario has been resisted is the assumption that the population of pre-contact North America was too small to support the kind of social organization required for large-scale infrastructure projects. This assumption has been progressively undermined over the past several decades by research that has dramatically revised upward that the estimated population of the Americas before European contact. The disease epidemics that followed European arrival were so catastrophic. Killing estimates suggest 70 to 90% of the pre-contact population in the Americas over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, that the populations encountered by early European explorers were shadows of what had existed before. The empty lands that European settlers described were not primordial wilderness. They were plague lands. Lands that had been depopulated so thoroughly and so recently that the forest had grown back over the fields, and the infrastructure had begun to decay, and the social systems that had managed large-scale projects had collapsed. If this revised picture of pre-contact population density is applied to Ontario, the implications are significant. A population sufficient to construct and maintain a 40-kilometre channel network in what is now Georgian Bay is not an absurdity. It is well within the range of what the pre-contact Americas are now understood to have been capable of, not only in the Ohio Valley, where the mound builder culture's enormous earthworks have been well documented, but in many other regions that have not received the same archaeological attention. The organizational question is related but distinct. Creating large-scale infrastructure requires not just bodies, but coordination. It requires decision-making capacity that extends across groups. It requires the kind of social structure that allows for large-scale collective action. The evidence for this kind of social structure in pre-contact Ontario has been limited, partly because the evidence that would document it is precisely the kind of evidence that the post-contact disease catastrophe would have destroyed most thoroughly. When you lose 90% of a population in a few generations, you lose not just the people but the social memory, the institutional knowledge, the organizational frameworks that made complex collective action possible. What you leave behind looks, to a later investigator, like a simpler society than actually existed, because the complexity has been catastrophically disrupted and the survivors are operating in a fundamentally different context than their grandparents faced. The Anishinaabe oral traditions again provide relevant information here, even if it is information that requires careful interpretation. The traditions describe a period in the history of the Great Lakes region when the before people were present and when the social organization of the region was substantially different from anything that the historical record documents. They describe a time when different groups of people shared the landscape in a more structured way, with defined roles and responsibilities, with systems of management and exchange that operated across large areas. They describe this period not as a golden age, not in mythological terms of paradise or perfection, but in practical terms, as a time when things were organized in a particular way, and then that way ended, and what came after was different. The transition is described in terms that different researchers have interpreted differently. Some read it as a description of a social collapse, an organizational disruption that preceded the arrival of the Anishinaabe themselves. Others read it as a description of environmental change, the flooding of land, the disruption of established patterns, that forced the reorganization of society on a smaller and less integrated scale. Some read it as both of these things simultaneously, as a compound catastrophe in which environmental change caused social collapse, or social collapse left the population vulnerable to environmental change in a way that it otherwise would not have been. What all of these interpretations have in common is an acknowledgement that something significant happened, that there was a before that was different from the after, and that the evidence for the before is preserved in the landscape in ways that are still accessible to someone willing to look for them. We should talk about the shield itself, more specifically. The Canadian Shield is approximately 4.5 million square kilometres of exposed Precambrian rock, and Ontario contains a substantial portion of it. The Shield presents specific challenges for archaeological investigation that are unlike the challenges faced in most other parts of the world where significant archaeological work has been conducted. The soil that accumulates on the Shield is thin, acidic, and often distributed in very shallow layers over the bedrock. Organic materials decay rapidly in this soil. The frost cycle, which in northern Ontario involves the ground freezing and thawing repeatedly over the course of the winter and early spring, causes a vertical movement of material in the soil that can displace archaeological deposits, mixing layers from different periods and making stratigraphic interpretation extremely difficult. The combination of these factors means that the standard methods of archaeological excavation, designed for the deep, stable soil deposits of sites in the Middle East or Europe, or the river valleys of the eastern United States often produce ambiguous results in Ontario. But let us think about what that picture might look like. Let us think about what we might find if we took the available data seriously and asked what it implied about the people and the culture it was pointing to. The channel network, if it is what Chevalier thinks it is, implies agriculture. Not necessarily the kind of settled, field-based agriculture that we associate with grain civilizations, but some form of deliberate management of water resources for the purpose of growing food or managing fish populations. The distribution of the boulder lines along the ancient Lake Nipissing drainage channel implies knowledge of the hydraulic geography of the region at a level of detail that would only be acquired through generations of observation and management. The stone foundations along the same channel imply permanent or semi-permanent occupation of locations chosen for strategic reasons related to the management of that geography. And the scale of what the sonar data in Lake Nipissing suggests, 2 square kilometers of constructed features in just one area of one lake, implies a level of investment in the infrastructure of that geography that is consistent with a population that was not passing through, but was settled, managing, developing over a long period of time. This is not speculation without basis. This is inference from physical evidence. The physical evidence is incomplete. The inference is tentative. But the direction of the inference is clear, and the fact that pursuing it would require challenging the existing frameworks of Ontario archaeology is not, by itself, a reason not to pursue it. The megalithic sites, the actual large stone structures, are where the story gets most strange and most difficult to accommodate within any conventional framework. Because unlike the channel features and the foundation patterns and the boulder arrangements, the megalithic structures in Ontario are not features that can be attributed to infrastructure or domestic occupation. They are something else. They are something that implies a different order of intention. The term megalith simply means large stone. It is a descriptor, not an explanation. When archaeologists speak of megalithic cultures, they generally mean cultures that invested significant labor in moving and arranging large stones in ways that served purposes beyond the purely functional. The great megalithic monuments of Europe, Stonehenge and the Ring of Brodgar and Newgrange, and the alignments at Carnac in Brittany, are the most famous examples, but they are part of a phenomenon that appears across many parts of the ancient world and that seems to have emerged independently in multiple contexts. The impulse to work in large stone, to invest enormous labor in shaping and moving material that is essentially permanent, appears to be one of the things that complex human societies do. It appears in places that had no contact with each other. It appears at roughly similar moments in cultural development, moments of increased social complexity, increased population density, and increased need for the kinds of things that large stone monuments typically seem to serve: territorial marking, ceremonial gathering, astronomical tracking, assertion of collective identity. The question of whether megalithic construction occurred in pre-Columbian North America is one that conventional archaeology answers essentially in the negative. There are exceptions, grudging and specific. The great earthworks of the Hopewell culture in Ohio, the platform mounds of the Mississippian culture at Cahokia, the Great Serpent Mound, these are acknowledged as evidence of large-scale pre-Columbian construction in eastern North America. But they are earthworks. They are soil and stone mixed, accumulated, shaped. They are not the movement of large single stones in the way that megalithic traditions elsewhere in the world involved the movement of large single stones. The conventional wisdom is that the megalithic tradition, as it existed in Europe and in parts of South America and in the Pacific, did not have a counterpart in pre-Columbian North America. The evidence from Ontario challenges this conventional wisdom, not definitively, not yet, but it challenges it. The first major megalithic feature that we need to discuss is not, strictly speaking, in Ontario. It is on the Ontario-Quebec border, in a region of the Laurentian Highlands that straddles the provincial boundary, and that has been, as a result of its jurisdictional ambiguity and its remoteness, one of the least systematically investigated parts of the pre-contact landscape in eastern Canada. In this region, aerial surveys conducted by the Quebec Ministry of Forests and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources over several decades have identified a series of large stone arrangements that are now the subject of a small but serious body of research. The arrangements include what appear to be standing stones, single large stones set vertically in the ground, of a kind that appears across the megalithic traditions of Europe and the Mediterranean, but that has not previously been documented in pre-Columbian North America, and alignments of large stones, set in lines or arcs that, in several cases, align with the rising or setting sun at the solstices or equinoxes. The largest of the standing stones documented in this region is approximately 4 meters tall and is estimated to weigh between 15 and 20 tons. It is composed of a type of granite that does not occur in the immediate area and that would have had to be transported from a source location approximately 30 kilometers to the west. It is set in the ground to a depth of approximately 1 meter in what appears to be a deliberately excavated socket, and it stands in isolation on a hillside that offers an unobstructed view of the eastern horizon, in the direction of the summer solstice sunrise. This stone was not discovered by archaeologists. It was known to local First Nations communities, who refer to it by a name that translates roughly as the one who stands watching, and it has been the subject of a long-standing traditional practice of visiting the site at specific times of year, a practice that the communities in the area describe as having been observed since before anyone can remember. It was brought to the attention of researchers outside the Indigenous community in the mid-1990s, when a forester who had encountered it during a survey mentioned it to a colleague who happened to be interested in archaeoastronomy. The colleague visited the site, measured its alignment, confirmed the solstice orientation, and submitted a report to the relevant provincial archaeology office. The response was that the stone was most likely a natural glacial erratic that had happened to land upright, and that no further investigation was warranted. The stone is not a glacial erratic. Glacial erratics are boulders transported and deposited by glacial ice, and they share certain characteristics that are well documented and easily identified. They show glacial abrasion, the characteristic surface modification that occurs when a stone is dragged along by ice. They are typically set into the surface rather than below it, having been deposited on top of the ground rather than inserted into it. They do not, as a rule, have the roughly conical or tapered shape at their base that facilitates standing upright in an excavated socket. The stone on the Laurentian Highlands hillside shows none of the characteristics of a glacial erratic and all of the characteristics of a stone that was selected, transported, and deliberately erected. These observations are not the product of fringe research. They were made by a geologist who examined the stone specifically to determine whether it was a glacial erratic, found that it was not, documented her findings, and submitted them to the same provincial archaeology office that had dismissed the original report. The response to the geologist's report was silence. The stone is still there. The file is still closed. Several hours' drive to the west, in the region between Lake Superior and Lake Nipigon in northwestern Ontario, there is a cluster of sites that represents perhaps the most extensive and most systematically documented collection of anomalous megalithic features in the province. This region, sometimes called the Lake Nipigon region, in informal discussions among researchers interested in these questions, sits at the edge of what was, in the post-glacial period, the boundary between two different ecological zones. To the north and west, the boreal forest. To the south and east, the mixed forests that once covered much of southern Ontario before they were cleared for agriculture. The boundary zone between these two ecological types is, in ecological terms, a zone of unusual productivity, a place where species from both zones overlap, and where the diversity of available resources would have been high. It is also, as it happens, the zone where the megalithic features concentrate. The Lake Nipigon region features include alignments, single standing stones, a structure that appears to be a stone circle of modest dimensions, and what several researchers have described as a cairn complex, a series of large piles of deliberately accumulated stones that occupies an area of approximately 2 hectares on a hilltop with extensive sightlines across the surrounding landscape. The cairns are substantial. The largest is approximately 4 meters high and 8 meters in diameter. They are composed of stones that range in size from fist-sized to boulder-sized, and the larger stones in each cairn appear to have been placed deliberately, with smaller stones packed around them to create a stable structure. The cairns have not been excavated. The hilltop site has been visited by researchers, but has not been formally investigated through either systematic surface survey or subsurface testing. Why? because the Lake Nipigon region is remote, because formal archaeological investigation requires permitting and funding, because the permits require demonstrated significance, and the significance is difficult to demonstrate without the investigation that the permits would permit. This circular problem is endemic to remote site archaeology across Canada, and it has the practical effect of concentrating archaeological attention on sites that are easy to access, well-known, and already established within the existing framework of cultural history, while leaving the sites that do not fit that framework uninvestigated. The anomalous sites remain anomalous because they are not investigated, and they are not investigated because their anomalous character makes them professionally risky to pursue. The stone circle in the Lake Nipigon region is smaller than the European megalithic circles that it superficially resembles. It is approximately 15 meters in diameter, composed of roughly upright stones, averaging about a meter in height, set in the ground at irregular intervals around a roughly circular course. It is not as impressive as Stonehenge. It is not as geometrically precise as the Ring of Brodgar, but it is a circle of standing stones in a location where standing stones are not supposed to exist. And when the researcher who first formally documented it, a graduate student in anthropology named Sarah Lemieux, who was conducting fieldwork in the region for an unrelated project in 2003, measured the alignment of the circle's axis, she found that it pointed, within a degree or two of error, toward the position of the setting sun on the winter solstice. She published her findings in a regional journal in 2005. The paper received little attention and no institutional follow-up. The astronomical alignments are significant not just because they demonstrate intentionality, not just because they prove that whoever created these structures was interested in the movements of celestial bodies and capable of tracking them with precision. They are significant because they demonstrate a continuity of purpose across a vast landscape. When multiple structures, separated by hundreds of kilometers, share the same astronomical orientation, the interpretation that each was created independently by different groups for different reasons and happen to align by coincidence becomes progressively less tenable. The probability mathematics of that coincidence become extremely unfavorable once you have 3 or 4 examples. With more than a dozen examples, as we have in Ontario, the mathematics effectively eliminate coincidence as a viable explanation. These alignments are deliberate. They are the product of a shared tradition, a shared knowledge, a shared purpose expressed across a landscape at a scale that implies coordination between communities separated by significant distances. What were they tracking? What was the winter solstice sunset, the summer solstice sunrise, the equinoxes? What did they mean to the people who built these structures? We cannot know with certainty. We can observe what these events meant to other megalithic cultures, in Europe and in South America, where the evidence for astronomical knowledge embedded in monumental architecture is extensively documented, and where the interpretation of that evidence has been significantly advanced over the past several decades. In those cultures, the astronomical events, marked by megalithic alignments, are generally associated with agricultural cycles, with ceremonial calendars, with the marking of time in ways that were important for the management of food production and social organization. The winter solstice marks the turning point of the year, the moment when the sun begins its return. The summer solstice marks the height of the growing season. The equinoxes mark the transitions between seasons. For a society that depends on knowledge of these transitions for the management of its relationship with the land, encoding the tracking of these events into permanent stone structures is a way of making that knowledge durable, transmissible, and publicly accessible. If the people who built the Ontario structures were tracking the same astronomical events that megalithic builders tracked elsewhere in the world, it implies that they, like those builders, were engaged in a form of land management that required knowledge of seasonal cycles over long timescales. It implies that they had a calendar system sophisticated enough to identify specific days within the year with precision, and it implies that they had the kind of stable, persistent social organization that could maintain the knowledge embedded in these structures and the practices associated with them across multiple generations. None of this is incompatible with what we now understand about the complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian societies in North America. It is incompatible only with the older, now largely discredited image of pre-Columbian North Americans as simple nomadic hunters and gatherers who left no permanent marks on the landscape. That image has been progressively dismantled by archaeological research over the past half-century, and what has replaced it is a picture of societies with substantial complexity, substantial organizational capacity, and substantial knowledge, societies that shaped the landscapes they inhabited in ways that are only now beginning to be fully appreciated. The problem is that the dismantling of the old image has been uneven. It has proceeded much further in some regions than in others. In the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Basin, where the earthwork cultures left monuments so large they could not be ignored, the revision of the old image is relatively advanced. In the Pacific Northwest, where the sophistication of indigenous social organization and material culture is visually apparent in the surviving artifact traditions, the revision has also progressed. But in Ontario, where the landscape is challenging, where the evidence is subtle, where the anomalies are scattered across a vast and remote area, the old image has been more durable. The revision has barely begun. We should talk now about the most extraordinary single feature in the Ontario evidence, the one that, if it is what the available data suggests it might be, would represent not just an anomaly, but a genuine paradigm shift in our understanding of pre-Columbian North America. The one that has been hinted at in several independent research threads, described in fragments in half a dozen different published reports, and never assembled into a coherent description, because doing so would require someone to take seriously the possibility that it is real. The feature is a set of structures, or what appear to be structures, located in a remote area of northwestern Ontario, accessible only by floatplane or a multi-day canoe journey, that were first documented in aerial photography commissioned by a forestry company in the late 1970s. The photographs showed, in an area where only natural landscape was expected, a series of geometric shapes visible from the air as slight variations in vegetation cover, the kind of pattern that in other parts of the world is understood to indicate buried structures beneath the surface, altering soil conditions in ways that affect plant growth above them. The shapes were linear, they were angular, and they were large, very large. The largest of the visible patterns, based on the aerial photographs, extended approximately 400 meters in one dimension and approximately 200 meters in the other. This is not the scale of a domestic structure. This is not the scale of a ceremonial platform or a stone circle. This is the scale of something else entirely, something that implies a kind of investment in construction that we associate only with the most developed and most populous of the ancient world civilizations. The forestry company that commissioned the photographs was not looking for archaeological evidence. They were looking at timber resources. The photographs were filed in their archive. A researcher named Thomas Beaumont, who had been working on an entirely different project involving the distribution of certain tree species in northwestern Ontario, gained access to the archive in the mid-1990s while looking for historical data on forest composition. He found the photographs, recognized the anomalous patterns, and spent the next several years trying to arrange a ground investigation. The investigation was eventually conducted in 2001, when Beaumont, working with a small team of volunteers and without formal institutional support, made the floatplane journey to the site. What they found on the ground was, in Beaumont's own words, strange and significant and deeply difficult to explain. The vegetation patterns visible in the aerial photographs corresponded on the ground to areas where the soil was different, where it had a higher mineral content and a different texture than the surrounding landscape, consistent with what you would find above a buried stone or earthen structure that had been decomposing into the soil for a very long time. More significantly, protruding from the surface in several locations within the area of the anomalous vegetation patterns were stones. Not scattered stones, not random glacial erratics. Large stones, some of them weighing several tons, arranged in rows. The rows were partially obscured by vegetation, partially buried by centuries of organic material accumulation, and partially disrupted by tree root growth, but they were there. Beaumont's team spent 3 days at the site, documenting what they could, collecting soil samples, measuring distances and orientations. The rows they documented extended, in the clearest preserved sections, for distances of 40 to 80 meters. The orientation of the main axis of the stone rows aligned, within the measurement precision available to them without professional survey equipment, with the cardinal directions, north-south and east-west. Not the arbitrary alignment of natural deposition, the deliberate alignment of people who knew where north was. Beaumont published a preliminary report of the investigation in 2003, distributing it to several university archaeology departments and to the relevant provincial authorities. The responses he received ranged from polite acknowledgement to active discouragement. One department head wrote back to tell him that the patterns he had documented were almost certainly the result of differential frost heave on a substrate of variable composition, a perfectly natural phenomenon that produces apparently regular patterns in stone distributions. This explanation is technically possible. Differential frost heave is a real phenomenon, but it does not produce rows of stones aligned to cardinal directions over distances of 80 meters. The physics simply do not work that way. Beaumont wrote back to say so. He did not receive a reply. We need to talk about what happened to the land, because the story of the Ontario megalithic sites cannot be separated from the story of what Ontario's landscape looked like before the colonization of the past 400 years. And the story of what that landscape looked like is one that most people, even people who grew up in Ontario, have never been told in a way that makes them understand the scale of what was changed. When the first European explorers and missionaries arrived in what is now Ontario in the early 17th century, they encountered a landscape that was not wilderness in any meaningful sense of that word. It was a managed landscape. The forests of southern Ontario were not the dense, tangled, impenetrable forests that the mythology of the frontier imagines. They were open. They were park-like in many areas. The understory had been cleared by regular burning, a practice that the Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region had maintained for generations, for reasons that combined the practical with the ceremonial, clearing sightlines for hunting, promoting the growth of berry-producing shrubs, and maintaining the health of the forest ecosystem in ways that required sophisticated ecological knowledge to manage effectively. The shorelines of the Great Lakes were not undeveloped. They were occupied. They were the sites of villages, fishing camps, trading posts, and ceremonial locations. The portage routes between lakes were maintained, cleared, and used regularly. The waterways were trafficked continuously. The forest was not empty. It was full of people who knew it intimately and who had shaped it over centuries to serve their needs. The landscape that the settlers cleared was not primordial nature. It was the result of thousands of years of human management, and the settlers cleared it so thoroughly and so rapidly that within 2 or 3 generations, the managed landscape had been replaced with fields and towns and roads, and the knowledge of what had been there before was largely lost. Lost except in the rock. The Canadian Shield does not clear easily. You cannot plough it or dam it or drain it and plant crops on it in the way that the settlers treated the more accessible soils of southern Ontario. The Shield endures, and in the Shield, in the rock and the water and the sediment, the evidence of what was there before endures with it, hidden, sometimes deeply so, but there. The lake sediment cores deserve special attention because they offer a window into the past that is independent of the physical structures and the oral traditions. A sediment core taken from the bottom of a lake is a time capsule. Each layer of sediment represents a period of deposition, and the materials preserved in each layer, pollen, charcoal, microscopic algae, organic compounds from the surrounding watershed, encode information about the environment and the human activity that was occurring at the time that layer was deposited. The analysis of lake sediment cores has become increasingly sophisticated over the past few decades, and it has produced a revolution in our understanding of past human impacts on landscapes that predates the written record. In Ontario, sediment cores from several lakes have been analysed for evidence of human activity. The results are instructive. The cores show clear signatures of significant human landscape modification beginning much earlier than the conventional archaeological timeline for the region would predict. Charcoal layers, indicating burning. Changes in pollen composition, indicating forest clearance. Increases in soil erosion indicators, suggesting disturbance of the land surface over watershed areas that are too large to be explained by the activities of small nomadic bands. These signatures appear in some cores at depths corresponding to dates well before the period when, according to the conventional framework, the populations of Ontario were numerous enough or sedentary enough to produce this level of landscape impact. The most striking of these cores was taken from a lake in the north-central part of the province, approximately 200 kilometres north of Sudbury, and was analysed by a research team from McMaster University in the early 2000s. The team was investigating paleoclimate, looking at how the vegetation of central Ontario had responded to climate changes over the past 12,000 years. What they found in the lower portions of the core was unexpected: a series of charcoal layers, indicating episodes of burning, at dates between approximately 8,000 and 10,000 years before the present, of an intensity and extent that the research team initially interpreted as evidence of lightning-caused natural fires. But the spatial pattern of the burning, inferred from comparison with other cores taken from lakes in the same watershed, was not consistent with natural fire patterns. Natural fires in boreal and mixed forest landscapes typically produce patchy, irregular burning patterns with considerable variability in intensity across the landscape. What the core network showed was evidence of burning that was, across a substantial watershed area, unusually regular, unusually synchronized, unusually consistent in its spatial distribution. These are not the characteristics of lightning fires. These are the characteristics of managed burning, of deliberate landscape management, at dates that, according to the conventional framework, are too early for the level of population and social organization that this kind of management would require. The McMaster team published their findings. The unusual burning pattern was noted in the paper as anomalous and not fully explained. The paper suggested as one possible explanation that the burning patterns might reflect unusual climatic conditions during the relevant period, creating conditions that made natural fires behave in uncharacteristically regular ways. This explanation was not developed further in the paper because the authors did not have the data to support it. It was offered as a possibility, not a conclusion. The possibility of managed burning was also mentioned, briefly, as an alternative explanation, but the conventional framework did not provide a context within which managed burning on this scale, at this date, could be accommodated, and so the anomalous finding was noted, and the paper moved on to other topics. The file was not reopened. This is, again, the pattern. The evidence accumulates in archives and databases and published papers where almost nobody looks for it. It sits there, waiting for someone to assemble it. And the picture that assembly would produce is one that challenges not just the conventional understanding of Ontario's pre-contact history, but the broader understanding of North American prehistory, within which that conventional account is embedded. But systems can be changed, frameworks can be challenged, evidence can be assembled. And the evidence from Ontario, assembled in the way that I have been attempting to assemble it for you tonight, points towards something that the existing framework was not built to accommodate. It points toward a level of cultural complexity, a scale of landscape modification, and a degree of astronomical knowledge in pre-Columbian Ontario that, if substantiated by the investigation that the evidence warrants, would require a fundamental revision of our understanding of who was here and what they did and how long ago they did it. There are people who live in Ontario right now who know this landscape the way that the before people knew it, not in the same way, not with the same depth of relationship that comes from generations of continuous occupation and careful management, but in a way that is meaningful and that carries something forward from the earlier relationship. These are the Anishinaabe elders and knowledge keepers who have maintained the oral traditions through all the disruptions of the colonial period, through the residential schools that were designed to sever the transmission of that knowledge, through the displacement and the disease and the poverty that colonial policies produced, and who are now, in some communities, working to share what they know with researchers who are willing to approach that knowledge with the respect it deserves. What these knowledge keepers say about the sites we have been discussing is consistent with what the physical evidence suggests. They describe the before people not with the vagueness of pure mythology, but with the specificity of historical memory. They describe particular places and particular features of those places. They describe practices associated with those places that make sense in the context of what the physical evidence shows. And they describe the relationship between the before people and the Anishinaabe themselves in terms that suggest the Anishinaabe have always known, at some level, that the landscape they inhabit was shaped by others before them, others whose identity and whose fate are questions that the oral traditions hold open rather than resolving. The Anishinaabe relationship with the underwater world is especially relevant to the Georgian Bay and Lake Nipissing evidence. The Anishinaabe cosmology places enormous significance on the boundary between the visible and the subaqueous. The underwater world, in Anishinaabe tradition, is not a metaphor. It is a real dimension of the world, one that can be accessed under the right conditions, that contains powers and entities and knowledge that are not available to surface dwellers by ordinary means. The traditions describe specific underwater locations, where the boundary between the surface world and the underwater world is thin, where extraordinary things have been experienced or can be experienced, where the underwater world impinges on the surface in ways that are perceptible to those with the knowledge to perceive them. Several of the locations described in these terms in Anishinaabe oral tradition correspond to areas where the bathymetric surveys and the sonar data show anomalous features on the lake floor. This correspondence is not something that the researchers who have documented it are willing to characterize too strongly. The locations in the oral tradition are described in ways that require interpretation, and the process of mapping traditional narrative onto geographic coordinates is always subject to the risk of imposing an interpretation rather than recovering one. But the correspondence is there, and it is present across multiple independent accounts in the oral traditions of communities that do not share stories with each other in ways that would explain a common geographic reference emerging from a common narrative invention. The most compelling of these correspondences involves a location in Georgian Bay that the oral traditions describe as a place where the floor of the lake opens, where the water is connected to something below the lake floor itself, and where the presence of what is below can be felt by those who know how to feel for it. This description, stripped of its ritual context, sounds like a description of a subterranean space, a cave or chamber beneath the lake floor, accessible from the lake bottom. Geologically, this is not impossible in the Georgian Bay area, where the limestone formations of the Bruce Peninsula create karst topography that includes underwater cave systems. But the specific location indicated by the oral tradition is not in the Bruce Peninsula karst zone. It is in an area where the bedrock should not, according to the geological maps, be producing cave systems of the kind described. An independent diver, working without any connection to the oral tradition, reported in the mid-2000s that he had found, during a dive in the general area of the described location, what appeared to be an opening in the lake floor at a depth of approximately 18 meters, leading into a space that his dive light illuminated as a chamber larger than his light could fully illuminate. He did not enter the chamber. He did not have the equipment for cave diving, which requires specialized training and apparatus that he lacked. He marked the coordinates and reported the finding to a regional dive club. The dive club secretary filed the report. It was not followed up on. When another diver attempted to relocate the site, using the coordinates several years later, she could not find the opening, which is not. In an environment where visibility is often limited and coordinates for underwater features are inherently imprecise, necessarily surprising. The opening may be real. It may be the entrance to a natural karst cave that the geological mapping has not documented. It may be the entrance to something else. We do not know. And the pattern by which we do not know, the way in which the evidence accumulates and then slips away before it can be pinned down by formal investigation, starts to feel, after enough examples of it, like something more than coincidence. Let us go further north. Let us go to the region around Lake Temiskaming on the Ontario-Quebec border, which sits at the edge of the Temiskaming Rift, a geological structure associated with one of the most significant tectonic events in the post-glacial history of the Shield. The Temiskaming Rift is the surface expression of an ancient fault system, and it produced a dramatic landscape of steep valley walls, deep cold lakes, and exposed bedrock that has attracted human settlement for as long as humans have been in the region. The Temiskaming area is also notable for the presence of silver and gold deposits that have been mined extensively since the early 20th century, and it was the activity of the mining industry that produced many of the early anomalous findings that we are now trying to piece together. Miners who dig deep into the Canadian Shield encounter a geological record that surface survey cannot access, and miners in the Temiskaming area have encountered things in the course of their digging that do not belong in an undisturbed geological matrix. The most significant of these encounters was reported in the early 1930s, during the heyday of silver mining in the area, when miners working at depth in a shaft near the town of Cobalt broke through a natural ceiling into what they described as an underground room. Not a natural cave, a room, a space with walls that were not irregular, not the product of natural dissolution or fracture, but surfaces that had been worked, flat, consistent, with what appeared to be marks on them that one of the miners described in his account, written decades later and preserved in a regional historical archive as drawings. The mine foreman was notified. The room was briefly investigated by the foreman and two other experienced miners, one of whom had worked at sites in Europe and recognized, in his own words, that the room looked like a chamber he had seen in an old mine in Wales, though this was not a mine. The foreman reported the finding to the mine management. The mine management's response was to seal the breakthrough, continue with the excavation, and not report the finding to any government authority. This was not unusual behavior for mining operations of the period, which routinely prioritized operational continuity over the reporting of anomalous finds. The foreman's report, made verbally to the management, was never reduced to writing by the management. The miner who later wrote his account was not identified in that account by name, and the identity of the author has not been established. The account is therefore hearsay of a kind that academic standards would not accept as evidence. But it exists, and it is not alone. There are other accounts from other miners from the Cobalt and Kirkland Lake and Timmins areas of northeastern Ontario describing similar discoveries at various points in the 20th century. The accounts share enough common features, rooms rather than caves, worked surfaces, marks that might be images, locations deep enough in the rock to be well below any level that could have been accessible from the surface in recent times, to constitute a pattern that is at least worth noting. Dupont attempted to bring his collection of accounts to the attention of academic archaeologists. He was told, in terms that ranged from polite to dismissive, that anecdotal accounts from miners were not the basis for academic investigation, that the natural processes of dissolution and fracture in limestone environments were capable of producing chambers that might be mistaken for artificial constructions by untrained observers, and that without physical evidence accessible to verification, there was nothing to investigate. He published his account collection privately in 2001 in a limited print run that was distributed mainly through regional historical societies, and that has largely been forgotten. The accounts are presumably still available somewhere. Dupont died in 2012 without having received any formal response to his collection that acknowledged its potential significance. The question that has been building throughout everything we have discussed tonight is the one that is most difficult to ask precisely because it is the most important. Who were the before people? Not their name, which we cannot know, not their language, which has left no record we can identify, but who were they in the sense of what kind of society were they, what kind of relationship did they have with the landscape, and what happened to them? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete, but it is not silent. If we listen to what it says carefully, if we resist the temptation to either overinterpret it or to dismiss it, a partial picture begins to emerge. The channel networks and the stone foundations suggest a sedentary or semi-sedentary society with a relationship to specific landscapes that extended across multiple generations. You do not build channel networks without a reason to be in the same place long enough to make them useful. You do not invest in permanent stone foundations if you expect to move on in a season or two. These are the investments of people who intend to stay, or who intend to return, or who are managing a landscape that they consider theirs in a persistent and multi-generational way. The astronomical alignments suggest a society with a sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics and with the organizational capacity to build structures that encode and transmit that knowledge. This is not the knowledge of individual observers. This is institutional knowledge, knowledge that has been systematized and that exists at the level of the culture rather than the individual. Building astronomical alignments requires not just the knowledge of where the sun rises on a specific day, but the capacity to translate that knowledge into the physical specifications of a structure, to organize the labor to build that structure, and to maintain the tradition of knowledge that makes the structure meaningful over generations. This is complexity. This is organization. This is the kind of culture that leaves deep marks on a landscape. The scale of the evidence. If the channel network reaches 40 kilometers and the Stone Row complex in northwestern Ontario extends over an area of several hectares, and the underground chambers reported by miners across northeastern Ontario represent a coherent system rather than isolated incidents, suggests a society that operated at a scale significantly beyond what the conventional framework attributes to pre-agricultural North America. Not necessarily a civilization in the sense of having cities, or writing, or the other features we conventionally associate with that word, but something that shares the essential characteristic of civilizations: the capacity for large-scale, organized, persistent modification of the landscape in service of collective goals. The astronomical alignments and the apparent investment in permanent structures also suggest a society with a temporal horizon that extended beyond the lifetime of individuals. You build structures aligned to the solstice because you expect the solstice to continue to be important, because you expect the community that marks the solstice to continue to exist, because you are building for generations you cannot see. This is not the short-term temporal horizon of a nomadic band focused on the immediate demands of survival. This is the long-term temporal horizon of a society that believes in its own continuity. What happened to it? The oral traditions provide the most direct evidence for the answer to this question, and the answer they suggest is environmental change followed by, or accompanied by, social collapse. The flooding of the land that is now under Georgian Bay and Lake Nipissing, the disruption of the ecological conditions that had supported the managed landscape, the loss of the agricultural or food production systems that the channel networks and the field management had sustained. These environmental changes occurred. We know they occurred because we know the hydrological history of the Great Lakes. The flooding was real. The land that is now underwater was once dry. The transition from dry to flooded, in some places gradual and in some places catastrophically rapid, would have been devastating to any society that had built its infrastructure and its food system on that land. This is a pattern that appears elsewhere in the pre-contact record of the Americas and of the ancient world. The loss of land, the disruption of established systems, the collapse of the social organization that had maintained those systems and that now found itself without the material base that had sustained it. The survivors dispersing, carrying with them the memory of what had been, encoding that memory in oral traditions that preserved it in altered forms across subsequent generations. The before people did not disappear. They became part of what came after, their descendants, carrying the genetic and cultural inheritance of the society that had created the channel networks and the standing stones and the underground chambers, were absorbed into the changing social landscape of the Great Lakes region as the hydrological changes remade the physical landscape. They were there when the Anishinaabe arrived, if the Anishinaabe were indeed later arrivals, or they were the ancestors of the Anishinaabe, the deep roots of a tradition that remembered, in the form of oral history, what the landscape had once been and what had once been done in it. The Anishinaabe themselves do not draw a sharp line between the before people and their own ancestry. The relationship described in the oral traditions is not the relationship of strangers or rivals. It is the relationship of predecessors, of those who came first and whose work persists in the landscape that the Anishinaabe know as their home. The before people are not aliens. They are ancestors. And the structures they left behind are not the ruins of a lost civilization from outside the tradition. They are the deep past of the tradition itself. This perspective, the Indigenous perspective, that places the enigmatic features of the Ontario landscape within a framework of ancestry relationship rather than external mystery, is one that academic archaeology has been slow to engage with seriously, but it is a perspective that offers something that the purely archaeological approach lacks. It offers continuity. It offers a framework within which the evidence can be situated in relation to living communities, rather than treated as evidence of a past that is entirely severed from the present. The before people are not a mystery to be solved and then filed away. They are ancestors to be honored, and the evidence of their work is the material inheritance of the communities that descend from them. This does not resolve the academic questions. The channels on the floor of Georgian Bay still need to be dived. The stone rows in northwestern Ontario still need to be properly surveyed. The underground chambers, reported by miners, still need to be located and investigated if they can be. The sonar anomalies in Lake Nipissing still need someone willing to put a remotely operated vehicle in the water and find out what those lines actually are. The academic questions are real and they deserve real answers. But those answers, when they come, will be more useful and more meaningful if they emerge from an investigation that takes seriously both the physical evidence and the living knowledge that the communities who have been in this landscape for millennia carry about what that evidence means. Let us talk about the Trent Severn waterway in a different light than most people think of it. Most people who are familiar with the Trent Seven think of it as a feat of 19th century Canadian engineering, a canal system that links Lake Ontario with Georgian Bay through a series of locks and lakes and rivers, stretching approximately 386 kilometres across the central part of southern Ontario. It is an engineering achievement that deserves the admiration it receives. But there is a deeper layer to the Trent Seven story that most people never encounter. The most significant physical evidence along the Trent Seven corridor is concentrated near Rice Lake, a broad, shallow lake approximately 90 kilometres northeast of Toronto, where the Otonabee River enters the lake from the north and the Trent River leaves it to the east. Rice Lake sits at a particularly significant point in the corridor, where the natural geography creates a kind of gathering place, a broad, sheltered expanse of water where travel routes converge and where the ecology is exceptionally productive. The wild rice that gives the lake its name is the kind of resource that, historically, drew people and sustained them. And the archaeological record around Rice Lake is correspondingly rich, or rather, the archaeological record that exists is correspondingly rich, with the qualification that much of what should be in the record may have been lost to the flooding and the agricultural development and the cottage country construction that have modified the Rice Lake shoreline over the past century and a half. What remains includes a series of linear earthworks on the northern shore of the lake that have been dated to the Princess Point complex, an archaeological culture that occupied the region approximately 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, and that represents the earliest clearly documented evidence of something approaching settled agriculture in Ontario, including the cultivation of maize. The earthworks are interpreted conventionally as enclosures associated with the Princess Point settlements, defensive structures, or community boundaries that define the extent of the occupation. This interpretation is reasonable, but the earthworks extend over a longer distance and follow a more geometrically precise course than would typically be expected for simple defensive enclosures, and they appear, in aerial photographs, to align with other landscape features in a way that suggests they may be part of a larger system rather than isolated enclosures. More significantly, the Rice Lake area has been the subject of multiple reports of submerged features that are older than anything the Princess Point complex would account for, features at depths that correspond to a period when Rice Lake was at a significantly lower level than it is today. The most specific of these reports comes from a series of dives conducted by a local dive club in the 1980s, documented in the club's records, but never formally reported to any academic or governmental authority. The divers described features on the lake floor that they initially interpreted as the remains of old docks or boat structures from the historical period, but that on closer examination proved to be inconsistent with historical construction methods. The materials were wrong for the historical period, the construction techniques were wrong, and the depth at which they were found was wrong, too deep for features that would have been at or above water level during the historical period when the relevant construction methods were in use. The dive club records describe two main features. One is a series of stone lines on the lake floor, similar in character to what has been described at other Ontario locations, but with the additional feature of what the divers described as a kind of step structure, a series of level platforms descending from the lake shore into the deeper water, consistent with what you would expect if someone had built a terraced structure on a slope that was subsequently flooded. The other is a concentration of large stones near the center of one of the shallow basins, arranged in a rough circle approximately 20 meters in diameter, with some of the stones appearing to have been worked. These descriptions sit in the records of a dive club in a rural Ontario community. They have not been formally investigated. They cannot now be easily relocated because the records do not include precise coordinates, and the underwater visibility in Rice Lake, which is often poor due to algae growth, makes relocation difficult even for divers who know the general area. They are one more fragment in the accumulating picture. The Ontario petroglyphs extend beyond the Peterborough site that we discussed earlier. There are dozens of documented petroglyph sites across the province, ranging from modest collections of a few carvings to extensive sites with hundreds of images. And within this broader petroglyph record, there are several sites that stand out for their content, for the presence of images that do not fit comfortably within the conventional framework of Algonquian rock art tradition. One of these sites is located on the north shore of Lake Superior, in a section of shoreline that is remote enough that it was not documented by researchers until the 1960s. The site includes images that are consistent with the known tradition of Ojibwe pictographs in the Lake Superior region, painted in red ochre on vertical cliff faces at or near water level. But it also includes, at one location on the cliff face, a section of images that do not resemble anything in the known pictograph tradition. These images are carved, not painted. They are deeply incised into the rock face, suggesting either a much longer exposure time or a much harder and heavier tool than the typical pictograph making process would require. And their content is geometrically abstract in a way that is distinct from both the representational images of the pictograph tradition and the geometric patterns typical of other Ontario rock art. The researchers who documented the site in the 1960s were unable to attribute the carved section to any known tradition. They noted it as anomalous, described it in detail, and included it in their site report without interpretation. The site has been visited by subsequent researchers, and the carved section has been the subject of informal discussion, but no formal analytical work. One researcher, examining the carved patterns in the mid-1990s, suggested that they might represent a star map, a representation of the night sky as seen from the Lake Superior shoreline at a specific time of year. The specific configuration she identified matched the sky as it would have appeared approximately 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, due to the precession of the equinoxes that causes the positions of stars relative to the horizon to shift measurably over long time spans. This interpretation was speculative, and she presented it as such, but it was based on a careful analysis of the angular relationships in the carved pattern. And if she was right about what the pattern was, the age it implied was consistent with the period when the land around Lake Superior was undergoing the most dramatic hydrological changes of the post-glacial period, 7 to 8,000 years ago, the period when the before people, if they existed, would have been experiencing the flooding of the lands they had occupied, the period when the channel networks and the stone foundations would have been going underwater, the period when whatever social and organizational system had sustained the managed landscape of Ontario was being disrupted by environmental changes that no amount of organizational capacity could prevent. Maybe the carved star map at Lake Superior is not a star map. Maybe it is a natural pattern that a researcher in the 1990s imposed a celestial interpretation on because she was looking for one. This is always possible, and the history of alternative archaeology is littered with the wreckage of interpretations that seemed compelling in the field and fell apart under scrutiny. But the pattern is there. The angular relationships are real. The question of what they represent is open, and the fact that a careful and technically competent researcher found in them a representation of the sky as it appeared at the time when the Ontario evidence most concentrates is the kind of thing that deserves investigation rather than silence. We should spend some time with the technology question, because it is the point where the discussion of pre-Columbian construction in Ontario most often gets derailed. The question is usually framed as, how could people without metal tools, without draft animals, without wheeled vehicles, have created structures of the kind the evidence suggests existed in Ontario? The framing is itself a problem, because it assumes that the absence of the specific technologies we associate with large-scale construction in other civilizations means the absence of large-scale construction capability generally. This assumption is wrong, and it is demonstrably wrong, because we have well-documented examples of large-scale construction achieved with exactly the technological package that pre-contact North Americans actually had. And here, the key insight is that organizational capacity is not primarily a function of technology. It is a function of social organization. The great earthworks of the Hopewell culture were built without metal tools. The massive carved stones of Nan Madol in Micronesia were moved and placed without draft animals or wheeled vehicles. The enormous stones of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which date to approximately 11,000 years ago and which represent the earliest known monumental architecture anywhere in the world, were quarried, transported, and erected by a population that appears to have been largely or entirely hunter-gatherers, without agriculture, without the surplus that agriculture is conventionally assumed to be necessary to support large-scale construction. The physical capacity to create monumental stone architecture does not require the full technological package of what we call civilization. It requires only organized human effort, sustained over sufficient time, directed by sufficient knowledge of the materials and the engineering principles involved. Pre-contact North Americans had all of these things. The evidence for this is not speculative. It is documented in the archaeological record from multiple regions. The Cahokia Mounds in Illinois, constructed by the Mississippian culture between approximately 600 and 1400 CE, involved the movement of approximately 55 million cubic feet of earth. The earthworks of the Hopewell culture, spread across Ohio, Indiana, and surrounding states, cover areas measured in square kilometers and represent an investment of labor that demographic studies suggest required the coordination of thousands of people over periods measured in centuries. These were not primitive peoples working at the limit of their technological capacity. These were sophisticated societies making deliberate choices about how to invest collective labor in the modification of their landscapes, choices that reflected complex social organization, long-term planning, and sophisticated knowledge of engineering principles. If this was happening in Ohio, if this was happening in Illinois, it is not unreasonable to ask what was happening in Ontario. Ontario is not a special case. It is not a place where human ingenuity and social organization were somehow absent while they flourished 3 states to the south. If anything, the exceptional productivity of the Great Lakes environment, with its extraordinary diversity of food resources across both aquatic and terrestrial zones, would have supported population densities and social complexity at least comparable to what existed in the Ohio Valley. The stone structures, the alignments, and the standing stones and the cairns require the same kind of analysis. Moving a 20-ton stone is a difficult engineering problem, but it is not an impossible one. The solution exists and has been demonstrated multiple times in the context of experimental archaeology. Large stones can be moved with wood, with rope made from plant fibers, with enough people and with enough knowledge of leverage and friction and terrain. The solution requires neither metal, nor wheels, nor draft animals. It requires rope, wood, and organized human effort. The organizational capacity to direct that effort is the key variable, and the evidence from elsewhere in the Americas makes clear that pre-Columbian societies were capable of that organizational capacity. The astronomical alignments require a different kind of capability, intellectual rather than physical. Tracking the solstices with precision requires sustained observation over years or decades, comparison of observations across time, and the capacity to translate the abstract knowledge of celestial mechanics into the physical specifications of a structure. This is not a technology in the sense of a physical tool. It is a form of knowledge, maintained across generations, transmitted from teachers to students within an institutional framework. We know this kind of knowledge existed in pre-Columbian North America because we have the evidence of it in the orientations of mounds and earthworks in the Ohio Valley, in the astronomical knowledge documented in indigenous traditions from across the continent, and in the specific sites, like the medicine wheel complexes of the Western Plains, where astronomical alignment has been definitively documented. The Ontario alignments fit within this documented tradition. They are not evidence of a technology that cannot be explained. They are evidence of a knowledge tradition that was present across a wide area of North America, but that has not previously been documented in Ontario, partly because the Ontario evidence has not been taken seriously enough to investigate, and partly because the forms it takes in Ontario, in stone rather than in earth, are different enough from the more studied examples elsewhere that the connection has not been made. The argument against the Ontario megalithic evidence is not, ultimately, a technological argument. It is a population argument and a framework argument. The population argument says that Ontario did not have enough people before European contact to create the scale of construction the evidence suggests. The framework argument says that if something this significant had existed in Ontario, it would already be in the archaeological record in a way that could not be ignored. Both arguments are weaker than they might initially appear. The population argument is based on demographic estimates for the post-contact period that are themselves contaminated by the catastrophic disease mortality of the contact era, and that in any case apply to the historical period, rather than to the much earlier period when most of the Ontario evidence appears to date. The framework argument is an argument from the absence of evidence, which is not the same as evidence of absence, and which is particularly problematic in a province where the investment in systematic archaeological survey has been, by any comparative standard, remarkably low. Ontario is one of the largest and most economically developed provinces in Canada. It has universities, research institutions, government agencies with mandates that include the preservation and documentation of cultural heritage, and a substantial Indigenous population whose relationship with the landscape carries historical depth that dwarfs anything in the written record. And yet the systematic, comprehensive, multidisciplinary investigation that the anomalous features of that landscape merit has never been undertaken. The resources exist. The knowledge exists. The technology exists. What has been lacking is the combination of institutional will, interdisciplinary coordination, and genuine openness to findings that do not fit the existing framework that such an investigation would require. There is a river in Ontario that knows things. This is not a poetic statement. The rivers of Ontario are archives. They carry sediment that encodes information about every event that has disturbed their watersheds since the glaciers left. They deposit that sediment in patterns that record the history of water flow, of soil disturbance, of fire and flood, and human modification, in layers that can be read by people who know how to read them. And the Mattawa River, which connects Lake Nipissing to the Ottawa River, and which was for centuries one of the most important travel routes in the entire Great Lakes region, carries a record that has begun to attract the attention of researchers who are asking the right questions. The Mattawa Corridor was the major eastward travel route out of the Great Lakes, the path by which goods and people move between the interior of the continent and the Atlantic coast. The voyageurs used it, the Algonquin people used it, the Ojibwe used it, and before all of them, whoever was here before them used it. The corridor is narrow, dramatic, incised into the Precambrian rock by the torrential post-glacial outflow that cut the valley as the Laurentide ice sheet retreated. The walls of the Mattawa Valley are rock, exposed bedrock rising steeply on both sides, and in that rock there are carvings. The Mattawa carvings are not well known. They have not been formally published in any comprehensive catalogue. They are known to local First Nations communities, some of whom consider the sites sacred and do not share their precise locations with outside researchers. They are known to a small number of rock art specialists who have encountered them in the course of fieldwork along the river, and they are known to the occasional boater or kayaker who happens to be moving along the Mattawa in the right conditions, at the right water level, to see the images that are visible on certain rock faces along the river. What the Mattawa carvings show, in the portions that have been documented and described, is a range of image types that span what appear to be multiple periods of creation. Some images are consistent with historical Algonquin and Ojibwe pictograph traditions, painted in ochre in the familiar style of the historic period. But beneath these, in some locations carved into the rock rather than painted on it, are images of a different character. Images that are older, in the literal sense that the weathering and patination on the carved surfaces is significantly more advanced than on the painted images. Images that show astronomical configurations, repeated geometric patterns, and in one location documented in a graduate thesis from the University of Ottawa in 1998, but not published in any peer-reviewed journal, what the thesis author described as a possible inscription in an unidentified script. The unidentified script at the Mattawa site was the most contentious element of the thesis, and the author acknowledged that the interpretation was highly speculative and that alternative explanations, including natural erosion patterns that resembled characters, could not be ruled out. But the description is interesting precisely because it is not an isolated report. The Peterborough petroglyphs have also been the subject of script interpretations, disputed and not accepted by mainstream researchers, but made by people with genuine expertise in ancient scripts. The Laurentian Highlands site mentioned the before people. The Lake Superior cliff face had its possible star map. A script, or something resembling one, at a third location along the major travel corridor that connects them all, is a data point that deserves weight, even if the interpretation is uncertain. A script would imply a great deal. A script would imply literacy in some form. It would imply the kind of information management that writing enables, the capacity to store and transmit complex information across distances and across time in a format that does not depend on the continuous transmission of oral tradition. It would imply a level of social complexity that most accounts of pre-contact Ontario do not acknowledge. And it would raise the question of what happened to that literacy, because there is no evidence of a continuous writing tradition in the historic period among any of the Indigenous peoples of Ontario, and if the marks at the Mattawa site, and possibly at Peterborough, and possibly at other sites that have not been investigated with sufficient attention, are genuinely scriptural, the script was lost. It joined the channel networks, and the stone alignments, and the underground chambers, and the managed landscape in the category of things that were once there, and are now known only through the indirect evidence of what they left behind. The Ontario evidence cannot tell us whether the before people had writing. It cannot even tell us conclusively that there were before people in the sense of a distinct and organized society that created the channel networks and the standing stones and the astronomical alignments. What it can tell us is that there are anomalous features in the Ontario landscape, many of them clustered in ways that suggest connection rather than independence, pointing toward a past that is more complex than the existing framework acknowledges, and that the investigation required to move from suggestion to evidence has not been done. But there is a difference between the geological regularity of the deep river granite and the features that we have been discussing tonight. The geological regularity is consistent across a formation. It appears everywhere that the rock has the same composition and has been subjected to the same tectonic forces. It does not appear selectively. It does not concentrate at specific locations. It does not align with astronomical events. It does not follow the routes of ancient waterways. It does not correlate with the oral traditions of the people who know the landscape most intimately. The features we have been discussing do all of these things. Their pattern is selective. Their distribution is meaningful. Their relationship to the surrounding landscape is purposeful rather than random. These are the characteristics that distinguish human modification from geological regularity, and they are present in the Ontario evidence in ways that cannot be dismissed by pointing to the geological background noise. The background noise is real. Any investigation of the Ontario anomalies would have to deal with it carefully and rigorously. But the signal is also real. It is there in the sonar data, and the aerial photographs, and the satellite imagery, and the sediment cores, and the oral traditions, and the archived field reports. It has been there for decades, accumulating, waiting for someone to take it seriously enough to assemble it into the coherent picture that it makes. We have spent a great deal of time talking about water, about the lakes and rivers and channels and the things that are hidden beneath them. But the Ontario evidence also includes a dimension that is almost entirely subterranean, that exists not in the water column but in the rock itself, and that represents perhaps the most technically challenging and most practically inaccessible part of the entire picture. The Canadian Shield contains an extensive system of natural caves and passages. This is not widely known because the Shield is not thought of as a cave-forming geological environment, and because the caves that exist within it are not of the kind associated with the great cave systems of the world. The enormous carbonate cave systems of Kentucky or Mexico or China, where limestone dissolves into vast networks of chambers and passages accessible to spelunkers and tourists, have no direct counterpart in the granite and gneiss of the Shield. But the Shield has its own cave-forming processes, and the caves they produce are real, if less dramatic and less accessible than the limestone systems that get most of the attention. Pseudokarst is the term geologists use for cave systems that form in non-carbonate rock through processes other than dissolution. The Shield produces pseudokarst caves through several mechanisms: fracture-controlled void spaces in the rock, where bedrock joints have opened wider through tectonic stress; surface erosion along zones of weakness that have been protected from glacial scouring; and what geologists call talus caves, spaces beneath the jumbled rock piles that accumulate at the base of cliff faces. These are real caves. Some of them are substantial, and some of them extend for distances that go well beyond what the processes that created them would be expected to produce. The eastern fringe of the Shield, where the Precambrian rock meets the younger sedimentary formations of the Ottawa and St. Lawrence valleys, is a zone of particular geological complexity. Here, the harder Shield rock and the softer sedimentary rock are in contact, and the differential erosion of these two formations over millions of years has created a zone of unusual geological instability where voids and passages can form through mechanisms that do not operate in either formation alone. There are known cave systems in this zone. Some have been explored, some have been mapped, but the zone is also the location of the mining operations in northeastern Ontario that produced the reports of underground chambers we discussed earlier, and the geological context of those mining encounters suggests that what the miners found may have been natural features of the pseudokarst system rather than artificial constructions. Or it may have been both, because one of the things that pseudokarst cave systems around the world show is a long history of human use. Natural caves, wherever they occur, are among the earliest and most extensively documented locations of human habitation and activity. The caves of France and Spain, where the most famous Paleolithic art is found, are natural caves that were modified by human activity, their natural dimensions exploited and in some cases enhanced by the people who used them for shelter, for ceremony, for the storage of resources, and for the creation of the art that has made them famous. The caves of the Eastern Shield Zone, if they exist at the scale that the various reports suggest, would have been equally attractive to the people who knew the landscape intimately. The possibility that the underground chambers described by miners in the Cobalt area were not purely artificial structures, but were natural cave spaces that had been modified by human occupation is actually more compelling than the hypothesis of entirely artificial construction. A society with the organizational capacity to build channel networks in Georgian Bay and stone alignments across the Shield would certainly have the capacity to identify natural underground spaces and to modify them for use. The modification required would be significantly less labor-intensive than construction from scratch, widening passages, leveling floors, improving ventilation, perhaps adding structural support in specific locations. The result would be a cave that looked, to a miner encountering it 1,000 years or more after it had been abandoned, like a mixture of natural and artificial features, because that is what it would be. The hypothesis of modified natural caves has an interesting implication for the distribution of the Ontario underground evidence. If the before people were using the Shield's pseudokarst systems, the distribution of their underground activity would follow the distribution of the pseudokarst, which is primarily along the eastern fringe of the Shield and in the zone of contact between the Shield and the sedimentary formations. This is exactly where most of the miners' reports of underground chambers come from. The geographic correspondence is not decisive, because of course the miners were also concentrated in the same zone, where the mineral deposits were richest, but it is consistent with the hypothesis. There is another underground dimension to the Ontario evidence that is less speculative and more directly documented. The ground-penetrating radar surveys that have been conducted in various parts of Ontario over the past few decades have produced results, in several locations, that are consistent with the presence of subsurface voids at depths of between 2 and 8 meters below the current ground surface. These are not natural geological features in the sense that they can be explained by the known geological processes of the area. They are spaces where the normal solid composition of the substrate is interrupted by a void. At several of the locations where these voids have been detected, the void shapes are regular enough to be inconsistent with natural cave formation. They are rectangular, or nearly so. They have consistent depths and widths. They appear, in the GPR data, as features that were created at the same time, in the same episode of construction, rather than as the result of the variable processes that produce natural cave systems. These GPR anomalies have been detected at 4 locations in Ontario that I am aware of from the published and informal literature. 2 of them are in the southern part of the province, in areas that have since been developed and are no longer accessible for investigation. One is in the Peterborough area, in the vicinity of the petroglyph site, which we have already discussed, and one is in the Georgian Bay area, near the site of one of the sonar anomalies that Chevalier documented. The coincidence of a subsurface void detected by GPR with a submerged surface feature detected by sonar at the same location is exactly the kind of convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence that makes a finding harder to dismiss. The Georgian Bay GPR anomaly was detected as part of a study of coastal erosion dynamics, not as part of any archaeological investigation. The GPR was being used to map the subsurface structure of the shoreline in order to understand how the shoreline was changing over time. The void was detected at a depth of approximately 4 meters below the current shore surface, under a section of shoreline that, based on the coastal erosion study, had been significantly above the waterline in the early Holocene. The void is approximately 8 meters long and 3 meters wide, with a ceiling height estimated from the GPR data at approximately 2 meters. There is, based on the GPR data, what appears to be a passage leading from the void toward the shoreline in the direction of the sonar anomaly on the lake floor. A 4-meter-long passage connecting an underground chamber to features on the lake floor, in a location where the surface was dry land thousands of years ago, at a site where the oral traditions of the indigenous people of the area describe a place of special significance related to the underwater world. The researchers who conducted the coastal erosion study noted the void in their data, described it as an anomalous feature, and suggested in their report that it might be a natural cave space associated with the pseudo-karst geology of the area. They did not investigate further. The study was published. The anomaly was documented. The file was, as always, eventually closed. Consider what it means to be the last person in your community who remembers a particular thing, the last person who knows a certain song, the last person who understands the significance of a specific location, the last person who can read the marks on the rock face by the river. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that position, and a particular kind of responsibility, and a particular kind of urgency, because the knowledge that you carry does not belong only to you. It belongs to whoever comes after you, if they can receive it, if there is anyone to receive it, if the circumstances of transmission have not been so disrupted that the knowledge simply cannot cross the gap. The residential school system in Canada operated for over a century with the explicit goal of disrupting the transmission of Indigenous knowledge. Children were removed from their families and communities, forbidden from speaking their languages, punished for practicing their traditions, and immersed in an educational system designed to replace the cultural knowledge they carried with a different cultural knowledge that served different purposes. The system was, in the terms of its own explicit intent, genocidal. Its designers understood that cultural knowledge, including the knowledge of place and the oral traditions that encode information about the landscape, cannot survive if the mechanism of its transmission, the living relationship between elders and children within an intact cultural community, is broken. The system was not entirely successful. It could not be, because the knowledge it was trying to destroy was too deep, too embedded, too interwoven with the lived experience of the land itself to be fully extracted. Knowledge keepers survived. Communities found ways to continue the transmission, imperfectly, under conditions of enormous duress, but enough to preserve something. And what was preserved includes knowledge about the sites we have been discussing tonight. Knowledge about the before people. Knowledge about the significance of specific locations along specific waterways. Knowledge about what is in the water and under the rock and in the landscape that most Canadians walk through without seeing. This knowledge is not freely available. It does not belong to researchers who arrive from universities with recording equipment and institutional authority. It belongs to the communities that have preserved it, often at great cost, across generations. Researchers who have attempted to access this knowledge without the relationship, the time, the demonstrated respect, and the reciprocity that the communities consider prerequisites for sharing it have found themselves without information. Researchers who have invested in building those relationships, who have approached the knowledge keepers as partners rather than sources, who have accepted the conditions under which the knowledge can be shared without insisting on the frameworks within which they want to use it, have learned things that are not in any published database. Some of those things are consistent with the physical evidence we have been discussing. Some of them go beyond what the physical evidence currently shows, pointing to sites and features that have not been formally documented but that, if they exist where the knowledge keepers say they exist, would add significantly to the picture. These are not things I can describe specifically, partly because the knowledge is not mine to share in detail, and partly because the communities that hold it have not given permission for its dissemination in a format like this. But the existence of this knowledge, the fact that living people carry specific information about the landscape that correlates with what the physical evidence is beginning to show, is itself significant. It is part of the evidence, not the most scientifically rigorous part, but part. The intersection between Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific investigation is one of the most interesting and most fraught spaces in contemporary Canadian research. The Western scientific tradition has a well-documented history of extracting knowledge from indigenous communities without acknowledgement, without compensation, and without the kind of relationship that the communities consider foundational to any legitimate exchange. The resistance of indigenous communities to participating in research projects on terms set entirely by Western institutions is not irrational. It is the product of a long and documented experience of the consequences of that kind of participation, and the result is a situation in which some of the most important evidence relevant to understanding the pre-contact history of Ontario is held by communities that have, entirely reasonable, grounds for not sharing it with the kinds of institutions that would be best positioned to investigate it. There are researchers who have worked within this space productively, who have built relationships over years or decades, who have participated in community-led investigations rather than institution-led ones, who have produced results that have been validated by both the academic community and the communities whose knowledge they engaged with, but they are the exception rather than the rule. The systematic investigation of the Ontario megalithic evidence, if it ever happens, will need to be premised on a different model of research than the one that has typically been applied to archaeological questions in Canada. It will need to be genuinely collaborative, genuinely respectful of Indigenous knowledge sovereignty, and genuinely willing to produce findings that serve the interests of the communities whose ancestors created what is being investigated. This is not just an ethical requirement, though it is that. It is a practical one. The knowledge that the communities hold, the specific information about specific locations, the understanding of which sites are most significant and why, the context that makes individual anomalies part of a coherent picture rather than isolated curiosities, is essential to any investigation that would produce results of real scientific significance. Without that knowledge, investigators would be searching a vast landscape for evidence of sites that may be subtle and that they may not recognize even when they find them. With it, the investigation becomes directed, purposeful, and far more likely to produce findings that justify the investment it would require. We are, in Ontario, at a moment that has the potential to be significant. The technological tools that would allow a serious investigation of the anomalous features of the landscape, airborne LiDAR that can penetrate forest canopy and reveal ground surface detail in even the most remote areas, high-resolution satellite imaging that can detect the kinds of soil and vegetation anomalies that indicate buried structures, sophisticated sonar and remotely operated vehicle technology that can investigate underwater features at depth, and ground-penetrating radar systems that have become more sensitive and more interpretable than those of even a decade ago. These tools are available. The scientific interest in pre-contact North America has never been greater, driven partly by the accumulation of evidence from other regions that has been forcing the revision of the old framework, and the Indigenous communities of Ontario are, in many cases, actively engaged in efforts to document and recover their cultural heritage, including knowledge about the pre-contact landscape. These three developments, technological capability, scientific interest, and Indigenous community engagement, have not yet converged on the Ontario megalithic question in a way that would produce the systematic investigation the evidence warrants. But the conditions for that convergence exist. The evidence is there, the tools are there, the knowledge is there. What is required is the will to bring them together. And perhaps, before the will materializes in the form of funded, institutionally supported research, it materializes in a different form, in the form of attention, in the form of people asking questions, reading the archived reports, listening to the oral traditions, looking at the sonar data that has been published in appendices to papers about fish habitat, looking at the satellite images that are publicly available and that, to someone who knows what to look for, show anomalous patterns in the Ontario landscape that have never been formally investigated. The evidence does not require the permission of an academic institution to be examined. The questions it raises do not require a research grant to be asked. What it requires is exactly what you are doing right now, in whatever place you are in, whatever hour it is, with the night settling around you and the quiet of the dark, allowing the mind to range further than it does in the noisy daytime. Attention, curiosity, the willingness to sit with the possibility that the landscape beneath Ontario holds more than anyone has officially acknowledged, and to let that possibility open into something more than comfortable dismissal. The thing about the Canadian Shield is that it does not forgive forgetting. Other landscapes absorb what is placed on them, grow over it, decompose it, return it to the soil from which it came. The shield does not do this to stone. Stone set in the shield stays set. Stone moved to a new position in the shield stays in its new position for longer than most civilizations last. The permanence of the shield is what makes the evidence we have been discussing so compelling, because the evidence has survived in spite of everything that has worked against it. In spite of the glaciers, which did not reach all of it, not all the way down, in spite of the colonization, which disrupted and destroyed so much but could not touch the rock, in spite of the forgetting, which erased the human context, but left the physical evidence intact, waiting. What the shield holds is not just the structures and the channels and the alignments and the chambers, it holds the timescale that puts all of them in context. When you stand on the shield and feel the ancient rock beneath your feet, you are standing on the oldest exposed surface on the planet, and the structures that were placed on it are, by any reasonable measure, among the newest things it has ever held. The 10,000 years of post-glacial human activity in Ontario is, on the temporal scale of the shield itself, the blink of an eye, a thin film of human meaning laid down on a surface that has been patient for 4 billion years. The cosmochemist, who studies isotope ratios in shield granite, and the Anishinaabe elder, who speaks of grandmother rock, are from very different vantage points and with very different vocabularies, saying something that is not entirely different. The rock carries the past. The past is accessible to those who know how to listen for it. Let us now talk about a site that represents what may be the most direct and most dramatic evidence for the scale of what existed in Ontario before the glaciers and before European contact. It is a site that has been formally acknowledged by the archaeological establishment, though in terms that significantly understate what the evidence at the site actually shows. It is a site that combines multiple lines of evidence, physical, astronomical, and traditional, in a way that is unusually coherent. And it is a site that raises questions so fundamental about the pre-contact history of the region that the conventional response has been to acknowledge the site, describe its obvious features, and then stop asking questions. The site is located in the Algonquin Park region, in the heart of the shield, at a location I will not specify more precisely, out of respect for the Indigenous communities that consider the site sacred and that have requested that its precise location not be widely publicized. What I can describe is what is there and what its existence implies. The site includes a series of large standing stones, the largest of which is approximately 3.5 meters tall, arranged in a configuration that aligns with multiple astronomical events: the winter solstice sunrise, the summer solstice sunset, the equinox risings, and, more unusually, the major lunar standstill, the point in the 18.6-year lunar cycle when the moon rises at its most extreme northerly position on the horizon. The lunar standstill alignment is significant because tracking it requires sustained observation over a period of at least 2 full lunar cycles, approximately 37 years, to confirm the full extent of the moon's movement along the horizon. You cannot identify the major lunar standstill by observation over a single lifetime unless you inherit observations from previous generations. The alignment of a stone structure with the major lunar standstill therefore implies a tradition of astronomical observation that extends across generations, maintained by a community that valued the knowledge enough to encode it in permanent stone. The Algonquin Park site also includes what appears to be a stone platform, a roughly circular arrangement of flat stones covering an area of approximately 5 by 5 meters at the base of the tallest standing stone. The platform surface shows evidence of fire use, fire-cracked rock, and dark discoloration of the stone surface that is consistent with repeated burning. The platform has been interpreted by the researchers who have described it as a ceremonial space associated with the standing stone alignment, a place where rituals were performed at the times marked by the astronomical alignments. This interpretation is reasonable and probably correct, but it is also underselling what the evidence shows, because the fire-cracked rock and the discoloration extend across the entire platform surface in a way that is consistent with not 1 or 2 uses, but extended, repeated use over a long period of time. This is not a place where something special happened once. This is a place that was used regularly, maintained, returned to, over a period that the evidence cannot precisely quantify, but that was certainly long. The oral traditions associated with the Algonquin Park site describe it as a place of council, a location where people came from across a wide area to meet, to exchange goods and knowledge, to perform ceremonies, and to renew relationships between groups that otherwise lived separately. The traditions do not specify when this use began. They describe it as ancient, in the way that the traditions consistently describe the significant places of the landscape, as places that were significant before memory began, whose significance was inherited rather than initiated. The before people are associated with the site in some versions of the traditions as the ones who first made it what it was, whose act of creation or designation established the site as a place of council that subsequent peoples honored and maintained. A place of council that was used by multiple groups over an extended period would leave exactly the kind of evidence the Algonquin Park site shows. It would be a place where the accumulated material of many visits and many people concentrated, where the evidence of use is layered in a way that reflects a long history of return, where the astronomical alignments that structured the calendar of gatherings are encoded in permanent stone so that the timing of the councils could be determined by anyone who knew how to use the site, without depending on the oral transmission of specific calendar knowledge. Its existence does not prove that Ontario had a civilization in the sense that the word is usually used, but it proves, or comes as close to proving as the available evidence can, that Ontario had a degree of intergroup social organization, a degree of astronomical knowledge, and a degree of investment in permanent landscape modification that the conventional account of pre-contact Ontario simply does not acknowledge. It is there, it is real, and it is waiting for the kind of attention that would allow us to understand what it actually represents. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something that cannot yet be spoken, that is waiting for the right moment, the right question, the right listener. The Ontario landscape has this quality. Drive north from Toronto, past the last subdivisions and the big box retail corridors, past the recreational cottages and the ski hills, into the Shield proper, and there is a moment when the character of the silence changes, when it shifts from the silence of empty space to the silence of something present and not yet spoken. People who are sensitive to this quality in landscapes, and there are more of them than the modern world acknowledges, tend to notice it in Ontario, tend to feel that the Shield is not empty but full, that the quiet of it is an inhabited quiet, that there is something in the rock and the water and the forest that is paying attention. This is not, I want to be clear, a mystical claim. It is a description of a psychological experience that many people have in this particular landscape, and an attempt to connect that experience to the physical reality that may underlie it. A landscape that has been occupied for thousands of years and managed by an intelligent, observant, cosmologically sophisticated people accumulates evidence of that occupation in ways that are not always visible to the conscious eye, but that register at some level of perception. The irregularities in the forest floor that indicate buried structures, the alignment of certain rock faces with the horizon in ways that direct the eye towards specific astronomical events, the patterns in the distribution of certain plant species that reflect ancient management rather than natural distribution. These are real features of the landscape, and they are features that would be perceptible, at some level, to anyone with sufficient familiarity with the landscape to notice when something is not quite as expected. The feeling of presence in the Ontario Shield may not be purely psychological. It may be the perceptual registration of evidence that the conscious analytical mind has not yet organized into explicit awareness. The oral traditions of the Anishinaabe describe the Shield as alive, as a participant in the world rather than a backdrop to it. The rock remembers, the water carries messages. The trees have witnessed things that the people who walk among them have not. This is, as I have said, consistent with the literal fact that the rock carries information encoded in its physical state, that the water carries sediment that encodes information about the events of its watershed, and that the trees, in the patterns of their growth rings and the composition of their wood, carry information about the climate and the soil and the light conditions of every year of their existence. The Shield is an archive. It is not a passive archive. It is an active one, in the sense that the processes that encoded the information in it are continuous, and that every year new information is being added to what is already there. The people who understood this archive most deeply, the people who had the most complete and most sophisticated access to the information it contained, were the ones who had been in relationship with it the longest. The before people, whoever they were, had that relationship. The Anishinaabe, who came after them, inherited what they could of it, and added their own accumulating layers of knowledge, and maintained the relationship across all the disruptions that the colonial period imposed. And what they know about the archive, what they can read in it that most researchers cannot yet see, is one of the most significant bodies of knowledge in North America for anyone trying to understand the pre-contact history of the continent. Let us turn, in these final hours of our time together in the dark, to the broader implications of what we have been discussing. Not just the Ontario evidence specifically, but what it suggests about the history of the Americas as a whole, and about the way that history has been constructed, maintained, and defended by the institutions that have had authority over it. The history of pre-Columbian North America, as it is conventionally taught, is a history of absence. Absence of writing, absence of large-scale construction, absence of the social complexity that we associate with civilization. This history of absence is not the product of malice, though it has served colonial interests that were and are malicious. It is, in large part, the product of methodological limitations and institutional inertia. The methods that early archaeologists applied to the North American context were designed for other landscapes, other material traditions, other kinds of evidence than what the Americas actually produced. And when those methods did not find what they were looking for, the finding was registered as absence rather than as a signal that different methods were needed. The revision of this history, which has been underway for decades and which has accelerated significantly in recent years, is one of the most important developments in American historical scholarship. The discovery that Amazonian civilizations had transformed vast areas of rainforest into complex agricultural landscapes, leaving evidence that satellite imaging has only recently begun to reveal. The growing documentation of the scale and complexity of Mississippian culture and its predecessors in the eastern United States. The evidence for sophisticated astronomical knowledge and long-distance trade networks across the pre-contact Americas. The genetic and linguistic studies that are forcing a revision of our understanding of when people arrived in the Americas and from where. All of these developments are contributing to a picture of pre-contact North America that is dramatically more complex, more dynamic, and more populated than the old narrative allowed. Ontario fits into this revised picture not as an exception, but as a piece of a larger story. The anomalous features of the Ontario landscape, the channel networks and the standing stones, and the astronomical alignments and the underground chambers are not isolated curiosities. They are the Ontario manifestation of a pattern that appears across the continent. Evidence of sophisticated, organized, persistent human modification of landscape at scales that the old narrative simply did not acknowledge were possible. The before people of Ontario were not unique. They were the Ontario representatives of a widespread and varied tradition of landscape management and construction that was present across much of the pre-contact Americas, and that was disrupted and in many cases destroyed by the contact-era catastrophe. Understanding this does not require any exotic theory. It does not require ancient astronauts or lost continents or advanced civilizations from outside the Americas. It requires only that we take seriously the evidence that is available, that we apply the methods that can reveal it, and that we respect the knowledge traditions of the people who have been carrying information about it across all the generations since it was created. The shield is patient. It will hold what it holds for as long as it takes for someone to look. 4 billion years of history and the few thousand years of human activity on its surface are not going anywhere. The channel networks are on the lake floor, waiting. The standing stones are on the hillsides. In the northern forests, their orientations unchanged and unchangeable by the passage of time. The underground chambers, if they exist as described, are in the rock, sealed by the forgetting of whoever sealed them, or simply by the accumulation of time. The sediment cores in the lake beds are preserving their layers of charcoal and pollen and organic compounds, adding new layers every year to the archive that is already there. The evidence is patient. The question is whether we are. There are things that the shield reveals only in specific conditions. The aerial photographs that first documented the anomalous vegetation patterns in northwestern Ontario were taken in late autumn, when the deciduous trees had lost their leaves and the contrast between different soil conditions was most visible. The sonar data that revealed the channel networks in Georgian Bay was collected during a period of unusually calm water, when the surface clutter that normally limits sonar resolution was minimized. The petroglyph carvings that are difficult to see in daylight become starkly visible in the low raking light of early morning and late evening, when the shadows they cast make the incised lines readable in ways that midday illumination does not permit. The shield reveals itself in conditions that require patience, that require waiting for the right moment, that require being there when the light or the water or the season creates the conditions for seeing what is otherwise hidden. This is a metaphor for the research situation as well, but it is also literally true. The investigation of what lies beneath Ontario has been hampered not just by institutional resistance and methodological limitation, but by the simple, practical challenge of being in the right place, with the right equipment, at the right place, moment, in a landscape so vast and so varied that the right moments are rare and the right places are often extraordinarily difficult to access. The cost of access in the Ontario context is not trivial. The sites we have been discussing, particularly those in the northern and northwestern parts of the province, are in some of the most remote terrain in eastern Canada. Getting to them requires float planes or extended canoe journeys or snowmobile travel in winter. Bringing research equipment to them is a logistical challenge of the first order, and doing the kind of systematic, comprehensive survey that would produce results of real scientific significance in these remote locations requires resources that are very difficult to assemble outside of major institutional support. This is one of the reasons that the research on Ontario megalithic sites has been so fragmentary, why it has consisted of individual researchers making 1 or 2 visits to individual sites, rather than the systematic multi-year investigation that the combined evidence warrants. The people who have done this work have, in most cases, done it with their own resources, on their own time, without institutional support, and often without the full range of technical expertise that would allow them to extract the maximum information from what they found. The work has been heroic in the literal sense, people doing something important against considerable odds because they believed it needed to be done. But it has not been the kind of sustained, systematic, well-resourced investigation that would move the evidence from anomalous to conclusive. What would such an investigation look like? In broad terms, it would combine airborne LiDAR survey of the major cluster zones to identify and map anomalous surface features beneath the forest canopy, systematic bathymetric survey of the key lake areas, Georgian Bay and Lake Nipissing especially, with follow-up remotely operated vehicle investigation of the most significant anomalies, ground-penetrating radar survey of a selection of land-based sites, particularly in the vicinity of the Peterborough petroglyphs and in the Algonquin Park region, systematic collection and analysis of sediment cores from the lakes within the cluster zones to build a regional record of environmental and human activity, and careful, community-led ethnographic documentation of the relevant oral traditions, conducted in full partnership with the Indigenous communities whose knowledge is essential to the investigation. This is not a small project. It would require significant funding, coordination across multiple academic disciplines, and a genuine partnership with Indigenous communities that would need to be built on terms acceptable to those communities. It would take years. It would produce findings that, in the current state of the evidence, are impossible to predict, which is simultaneously its greatest scientific value and its greatest obstacle to funding in an academic system that rewards predictable outcomes. And it would produce, almost certainly, findings that challenge the existing frameworks of Ontario archaeology and Canadian pre-contact history in ways that would generate controversy and resistance from within those frameworks. But the investigation would also produce something else. It would produce knowledge, real, specific, grounded knowledge about what was here before, about who built it, about how long they were here, about what happened to them, about the relationship between the landscape of Ontario as it has been managed for thousands of years and the landscape as it exists today. This knowledge has value that goes beyond the academic. It has value for the Indigenous communities whose ancestors created what is being investigated. It has value for everyone who wants to understand the deep history of the land they live on. And it has value for the broader project of understanding what human beings have done and been capable of across the full span of our time on this planet. The mystery of the Ontario megalithic sites is not a mystery for its own sake. It is not an entertainment, though it is certainly fascinating. It is a question about identity, about heritage, about what we know and what we have chosen not to know about the history of this particular piece of the earth. And the fact that the question has not been seriously asked, in a sustained and systematic way, by the institutions that have the resources to answer it, is itself a fact worth sitting with, worth wondering about, worth, perhaps, being a little angry about. Because people made these things, real people, with names that are lost and faces that are gone and lives that we cannot recover in detail, but who were as human as you are, as curious, as purposeful, as capable of beauty and organization and knowledge. They moved stones that weighed 20 tons. They dug channels in the floors of lakes. They tracked the stars with sufficient precision to align their structures with events that occur once in every 18.6 years. They went underground, into the dark, and they worked there, and they made the darkness into a space for something. We do not know what. We have only the residue, the scraps, the traces. And those traces are sufficient to say that they were here, that they mattered, that what they did shaped the landscape that everyone who came after them lived in and moved through and built on. They are part of the story of this land, part of the story of what Ontario is and has been. And the silence around them, the institutional and academic silence, the near total absence of this story from the public understanding of Canadian history, is a silence that deserves to be broken. Let us spend some time with the geography of the evidence as a whole, looking at the Ontario anomalies not as individual sites, but as a system, trying to understand what the distribution of the evidence across the landscape implies about the culture that created it. The cluster zones we have identified tonight are not random. The Sudbury Basin Cluster, the Georgian Bay Cluster, the Lake Nipissing and Mattawa River Corridor, the Peterborough and Trent Severn Corridor, the Lake Nipigon region, the Algonquin Park region, the Eastern Shield Fringe where the mining reports concentrate. Map these clusters and draw lines between them, and what emerges is something that looks like a network, a connected system of significant locations, separated by distances that range from 100 to several hundred kilometers, linked by the waterway corridors that would have been the routes of travel and communication in the pre-contact period. The spatial logic of this network is the spatial logic of a trade and communication system. The cluster zones are located at the nodes, the points where multiple waterways converge, where different ecological zones meet, where the physical geography creates natural gathering places. The corridors between them follow the routes that the waterways provide, and the scale of the system, spanning the entire province of Ontario from its southern shores to its northern forest, implies a level of intergroup organization and communication that operated across a geographic area of enormous extent. A trade and communication network of this scale would have been a remarkable achievement for any pre-state society, but it would not have been unprecedented. We know that such networks existed in the pre-contact Americas. The Hopewell interaction sphere, the network of exchange and communication that connected Hopewell culture sites across much of eastern North America between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE, spanned an area from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes and from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. Material goods, ideas, artistic traditions, and social practices moved across this network with a regularity and consistency that implies sustained communication between distant groups. The Ontario evidence may represent the northern extension of, or a parallel development to, this kind of interregional system. The clustering of astronomical alignments at specific nodes in the network is significant in this context. In trade and communication networks, the coordination of timing is crucial. When you have groups in different locations who need to coordinate their movements, their gatherings, their exchanges, you need a shared calendar. A calendar that all parties can read independently, without needing someone to carry the information from one place to another. Astronomical events, and particularly the major solar events that are visible everywhere and that recur with perfect regularity, provide exactly this kind of shared temporal reference. Building structures that mark specific astronomical events at the major nodes of a trade network is a way of encoding the calendar into the landscape itself, making it available to anyone who knows how to use the landscape as a timepiece. This is exactly what the megalithic alignments of the Ontario network appear to be doing. They are not just ceremonial sites. They are also, and perhaps primarily, temporal reference points. Places where the calendar can be read from the landscape. Places where a traveler arriving at a node of the network can determine, from the relationship between the sun or the moon and the standing stones, what point in the year it is and when the next gathering is scheduled. This is not a speculative function. It is the documented function of comparable sites in other parts of the world. The stone circles of the British Isles, the medicine wheels of the North American plains, the astronomical observatory structures of Mesoamerica, all function in this way or in ways that are closely analogous to it. The Ontario network, if it is real, was not just an archaeological curiosity. It was a functional infrastructure for the management of intergroup relationships across a vast landscape. It encoded a shared calendar, provided gathering places with well-understood astronomical timing, facilitated the exchange of goods and knowledge between geographically distant groups, and maintained the social connections that make large-scale cooperation possible. It was, in short, the kind of institution that makes a society more than the sum of its constituent groups. It was the connective tissue of something that, while it may not have had the political integration of a state, had the functional integration of a civilization in the broadest sense of that word. The loss of this institution, whatever its final cause, would have been catastrophic for the societies that depended on it. The disruption of the calendar reference points, the loss of the gathering places, the severing of the communication and exchange routes, the collapse of the intergroup relationships that the network had maintained. These losses would have been experienced not just as the disappearance of specific places, but as the dissolution of the social fabric that had connected groups across the landscape for generations. The survivors would have found themselves in a world that was, in organizational terms, much smaller than the one their grandparents had known. The vast network would have contracted into the local. The sophisticated calendar would have been replaced with local observations. The long-distance exchange would have been replaced with whatever could be maintained through the nearest neighboring communities. This is not a story of catastrophic destruction, of cities burned and populations massacred. It is a story of gradual contraction, of organizational complexity dissolving because the physical and demographic base that supported it was no longer adequate to maintain it. The hydrological changes that flooded the agricultural lands, the climate changes that disrupted the ecological conditions that had supported the managed landscape, the disease episodes that, even in the pre-contact period, could devastate small populations and interrupt the cultural transmission that kept complex institutions alive. Any of these, in combination or alone, could produce the kind of gradual organizational contraction that the evidence suggests occurred in Ontario sometime between several thousand and several hundred years before European contact. The Ontario that the first European explorers encountered was not the Ontario that had existed 1,000 years earlier, or 2,000 years, or 5,000. The complexity that the evidence suggests existed had been contracting for a long time before the Europeans arrived. What the Europeans found was not primordial wilderness. It was the remnant of something much larger, managing itself through the disruptions of a long organizational decline, preserving what it could of the knowledge and the relationships and the cosmological frameworks that had once sustained a much more elaborate civilization of landscape. And then the Europeans arrived, and the disruption accelerated beyond anything that had come before. The diseases killed at rates that make everything else look modest in comparison. The social systems that had been contracting for centuries collapsed entirely. The knowledge keepers died before they could transmit what they knew. The physical remains of the network, the standing stones and the channels and the gathering places, were now landscapes without the human context that had made them meaningful. They became, to the new arrivals who encountered them, simply features of the natural landscape, odd-looking rocks and straight-looking lake floor lines and strangely regular patterns in the vegetation, noticed and then forgotten, but not entirely forgotten, never entirely forgotten, because the shield holds what is placed on it, and the people who survived held what they could, and the rock and the water and the sediment continued their quiet archiving, undisturbed by the human drama playing out on the surface. And now, in the 21st century, with the tools to read the archive becoming available, and the interest in reading it growing, and the indigenous communities who hold the living knowledge beginning to share it in contexts where it can meet the physical evidence, productively, the possibility exists that the silence can be broken. that the before people can begin to be known again. Not fully, not in the detail that we would like, but enough. Enough to understand that they were here. Enough to understand what they did. Enough to give them the acknowledgement that the magnitude of their achievement deserves. Before we arrive at the close of tonight's journey, there is one more piece of the Ontario evidence that deserves careful attention, because it is perhaps the most recent and the most directly accessible, and because it demonstrates that the discovery of anomalous features in the Ontario landscape is not an activity confined to the past, not a matter of archive research and old reports, but something that is happening right now, in the present, as new technologies are applied to a landscape that has never been systematically examined with the tools now available. Airborne LiDAR, the technology that uses laser pulses from aircraft or drones to build a precise three-dimensional model of the ground surface beneath even dense forest canopy, has in the past decade produced revolutionary findings in archaeological contexts around the world. It was LiDAR that revealed the full extent of the Maya lowland civilization in Guatemala, detecting tens of thousands of previously unknown structures beneath the jungle canopy and fundamentally revising our understanding of the scale and complexity of classic Maya society. It was LiDAR that revealed the vast network of geometric earthworks beneath the Amazon rainforest in Bolivia and Brazil. It is LiDAR that is currently being used to map the extent of pre-contact agricultural systems in Amazonia, Mesoamerica, and Southeast Asia in ways that are producing almost continuous revision of the existing historical narrative. LiDAR has been applied in Ontario, but not systematically and not with archaeological investigation as a primary purpose. The Ontario government, through its Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, has commissioned LiDAR surveys of substantial portions of the province for the purposes of forest management, mineral exploration support, and hydrological modelling. These surveys exist. The data they have produced is in databases maintained by the provincial government, and that data, if processed and analysed with archaeological detection as a goal, would reveal ground surface detail beneath the Ontario forest canopy at a resolution that no previous survey technology has achieved. Has this been done? Has anyone taken the provincial LiDAR data and run it through the kind of processing algorithms that archaeologists use to detect buried or hidden structures in similar data from other parts of the world? The answer, as far as I have been able to determine, is no. Not systematically. Not across the major cluster zones. The technology exists. The data exists. The analytical methods exist. The application of those methods to the Ontario data for archaeological purposes has not been done. The reason, again, is the familiar combination of institutional compartmentalization and methodological conservatism. The people who maintain the LiDAR data are in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. The people who would benefit from applying it to archaeological questions are in universities and in the provincial heritage management system. These two groups do not typically communicate about the potential archaeological applications of resource management data. The data sits in its databases, accessible in principle, but practically inaccessible to the researchers who would know what to do with it, because accessing it requires navigating bureaucratic procedures designed for its intended purposes rather than for archaeological research. This is not a complaint. It is a description of a situation that is changing slowly. As the archaeological value of remotely sensed government data becomes more widely recognized, and as the institutional barriers to its repurposing for archaeological research are gradually lowered, the work that produced the Maya LiDAR results, the work that is producing results across the Amazon, is creating precedents and creating awareness that is beginning to influence how provincial and federal governments in Canada think about the potential uses of the data they collect. The application of Ontario's existing LiDAR data to the systematic detection and mapping of anomalous surface features across the major cluster zones is something that could, in principle, be accomplished within the next decade, possibly within the next few years. What would it find? Based on what we know about the distribution of anomalies that have already been identified by less comprehensive methods, the LiDAR analysis would likely confirm and extend the patterns already visible in the aerial photographs and satellite imagery. It would reveal the full extent of the stone feature networks in the cluster zones. It would detect structures that have not been previously identified because the existing survey methods were not capable of seeing beneath the canopy It would produce a map of the Ontario landscape that, for the first time, showed all of the anomalous features in their spatial relationships to each other and to the natural landscape, allowing the systemic patterns that are currently visible only in fragments to be seen as a whole. And what that whole would show, if the existing evidence is representative, is a landscape that was more extensively and more systematically modified by human activity before European contact than anyone has officially acknowledged. A landscape in which the natural and the human-made are intertwined in ways that we are only beginning to have the tools to separate and understand. A landscape that holds, beneath its forest canopy and its lake surfaces and its soil layers, the evidence of a past that has been waiting for the right moment and the right methods to be recovered. We are at the beginning of that moment. The tools are becoming available. The frameworks are changing, driven by discoveries elsewhere that are forcing a revision of what we think is possible in pre-contact North America. The Indigenous communities whose knowledge is essential to any serious investigation are increasingly engaged in processes of cultural recovery and heritage documentation that create new possibilities for collaboration. And the evidence itself continues to accumulate in sonar datasets and GPR surveys and satellite imagery and oral tradition documentation and sediment core analyses in the quiet, continuous, unhurried way that evidence accumulates when the landscape is doing the accumulating. The shield is patient, the water is patient, the rock is very patient. Whatever lies beneath Ontario has been lying there for a long time and will continue to lie there, adding nothing and taking nothing away, waiting for the question to be asked with sufficient seriousness and the method to match the question. We have the question. We are developing the method. What remains is to ask the question with the seriousness it deserves, which means committing the resources and the attention and the institutional will that a question of this magnitude requires. That is the task that lies ahead. The specific, practical, unromantic work of investigation, of survey and analysis, and excavation, and dating, and publication, and peer review and revision, and the long, slow, careful process by which evidence becomes knowledge and then understanding. The mystery of Ontario's megalithic sites will not be resolved by storytelling, however careful and thorough. It will be resolved by work, but storytelling matters too. Because before the work can happen, before the resources can be assembled, and the methods applied and the findings produced, someone has to know that the question exists. Someone has to understand that what lies beneath Ontario is worth investigating. Someone has to care enough about the before people, about who they were and what they made and what happened to them, to support and encourage and demand the investigation that the evidence warrants. That someone is, right now, listening to this in the dark, in your bedroom or your apartment or your car or wherever you have ended up at whatever hour it is. You are the audience for this story. And the fact that you are still here, that you have stayed with this for as long as you have, suggests that the question matters to you, that the mystery is real to you, that the before people, whose names you will never know, whose faces you will never see, whose language you will never hear, have become, through the telling of this story, something more than abstractions. They have become people. Real people who built things and observed the stars and managed the landscape and encoded their knowledge in the rock that endures after them. People who deserve to be known, as well as the surviving evidence allows them to be known, by the people who now live in the landscape they shaped. And so we come to the end of our time together in the dark, having travelled far without moving anywhere, having gone beneath the surface of a landscape that most people think they know, and found it to be stranger and older and more significant than the official account has acknowledged. Think about what Ontario is, in the context of everything we have discussed tonight. It is the most populous province in Canada, home to more than 14 million people, with one of the largest economies in North America, with universities and research institutions of international standing, with a provincial government that has the resources to fund systematic archaeological investigation of its cultural heritage and a mandate to do so. It is a province whose southern landscape is almost entirely developed, whose northern landscape is one of the largest remaining expanses of intact boreal ecosystem in the world. It is a province whose Indigenous peoples have maintained their cultural traditions and their knowledge of the landscape through extraordinary adversity, and whose knowledge of the pre-contact history of the land is irreplaceable. And it is a province whose pre-contact history, at the depth of time that the evidence suggests is relevant, is essentially unknown to the people who live in it. This is a remarkable situation. Remarkable and not perhaps entirely coincidental. The erasure of the deep history of Ontario from public consciousness is not simply the result of the evidence being obscure or the methods for investigating it being unavailable. It is partly a result of the colonial history of the province, which created strong institutional and cultural incentives not to look too closely at what was here before, because looking too closely at what was here before raises uncomfortable questions about the nature and the legitimacy of what replaced it. A landscape that was empty before European contact, that was inhabited only by small, nomadic, pre-literate bands who left no permanent mark on it, is a landscape that is available for the kind of claiming and transforming that colonialism requires. A landscape that was extensively and sophisticatedly managed for thousands of years by people who created permanent infrastructure and encoded knowledge in the rock. A landscape that carries the evidence of a complex and organized civilization is a different kind of landscape. It carries obligations that the empty landscape does not. It raises questions about ownership and stewardship, and respect that the conventional narrative has been structured to avoid. These are not comfortable thoughts. They are not thoughts that most people, driving the 400 north for a cottage weekend, stopping at the Tim Hortons in Barrie, watching the shield landscape open up through the windshield as the highway climbs out of the limestone plain and onto the ancient rock, are likely to be having. But they are thoughts that the evidence forces, if you take the evidence seriously, and taking the evidence seriously is the beginning of the work that needs to happen. The shield will hold what it holds for as long as it takes. The before people made their marks in material that endures. The Anishinaabe elders carry what they carry in minds and memories that are as rich and as complex as the landscape itself. And the researchers who have spent years accumulating the anomalous findings, filing the reports, attempting to assemble the picture that the institutions were not yet ready to see, those researchers were not wasting their time. They were maintaining the possibility of knowing against the institutional current. They were doing the work that precedes the work. The investigation that the Ontario megalithic evidence warrants has not yet happened, but the conditions for it to happen are closer to existing than they have ever been. The tools are there. The interest is growing. The Indigenous communities are engaged. The only thing that is still missing is the institutional will to commit the resources that the question requires. And perhaps, if enough people know the question exists, if enough people are sitting with the mystery of what lies beneath Ontario, feeling the weight of all those thousands of years of human history that have not yet been acknowledged, perhaps the institutional will can be generated from the ground up. From people asking their representatives why the sonar anomalies in Georgian Bay have never been properly investigated. From people asking their universities why the cluster zones have never been subject to systematic LiDAR analysis. From people asking the knowledge keepers in their communities what they know about the before people and listening with the respect that the knowledge deserves. From people simply paying attention, which is the foundation of everything that follows. The night is quiet. The shield is out there, somewhere beyond the walls of wherever you are, patient and vast and holding what it holds. The lake floors are still. The sediment is still accumulating, layer by layer, encoding this year's pollen and charcoal and organic compounds into the archive that will still be readable 1,000 years from now, if someone cares to read it. The standing stones, in the remote forests and on the hillsides that nobody visits, are oriented the way they have always been oriented, measuring the same astronomical events they were built to measure, unchanged by everything that has happened around them. The before people are not here anymore, but what they made, and what they made says something about who they were and what they valued and what kind of relationship they had with this landscape that we are still only beginning to understand. They were here. They mattered, and the stone remembers. Let that settle in the quiet. Let the mystery of it, the real and specific and physical mystery of what lies beneath Ontario, accompany you into sleep, not as an anxiety, but as a presence. The way the shield itself is a presence, vast, patient, old, holding more than we can yet see, full of something that has not yet been spoken, waiting for the right question, the right method, the right moment of collective attention to make it speakable at last. The channel networks are on the lake floor, waiting. The standing stones are in the forest, waiting. The underground chambers are in the rock, waiting. And you, wherever you are, whatever time it is, Whatever landscape is beyond your window tonight, you are now someone who knows that there is more to the story of Ontario than has been officially told. You are someone who has sat with the question and felt its weight. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the beginning of everything. The question of who built what lies beneath Ontario belongs to everyone who drives those highways north and watches the shield open up around them. Everyone who has felt that particular quality of presence in the Ontario wilderness that is not quite explainable by the trees and the water alone. Rest now. Let the old rock hold you. Let the patient shield carry you into dreams where maybe, if you are lucky, the before people are still building, still moving their stones, still watching their stars, still living in the managed landscape that the water has not yet come to cover, still here, in the form that is the only form that is left to them, the evidence they placed in a material that endures, waiting for the world to be ready to see it. Good night, and thank you for coming with me beneath Ontario.